Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the February 3rd, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. We're going to give it a minute while we allow participants to enter the meeting. All right. Ms. Fennessy, can we do a roll call, please?
Thank you. I'll start the roll call. Chair Escobedo,
Here.
Vice Chair Bonderson,
Here.
Commissioner Bakke,
Here.
Commissioner Higgins,
Here.
Commissioner Lodge,
Here.
Commissioner Wardlow,
Here.
and Commissioner Wiscombe.
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Fennessy. And with that, we will move on to preliminary matters. And we'll start with requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of X agenda items. Mr. Bus.
Thank you, Chair Escobedo. We have none.
And do we have any announcements or appeals?
Thank you. We will have one announcement that we'll handle during the administrative portion of the agenda related to a staff hearing officer item.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll move on to review, consideration, and action on the following draft Planning Commission meeting minutes for January 13th, 2022 and January 20th, 2022. And I'll turn it over to my fellow commissioners. And Vice Chair Bonderson, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Escobedo. I have sent an edit to Ms. Fennessy by email, but I'd like to also share it here for January 20th, 2022. And that is for the, let's see, it's on page 2 of 4, last paragraph under Vice Chair Bonderson. It's the, I'm just trying to make it as smooth as possible. It's on the third sentence where it says as well as requiring a CDP. So where it says, let's see. Oh, my apologies. I just read that wrong. I started with the wrong as. It's on the second to last sentence right at the end. It says as she believes that it should be an easier process. And here we've added, I'd like to have added, and it goes against the whole purpose of the state legislature for ADUs, comma, and continues the sentence that's already here, and thus should be exempt from a CDP.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Any other edits from the commission for either the January 13th or January 20th? And I'm not seeing any. So do we have a motion to approve both meeting minutes?
I can make the motion.
We got a motion from Vice Chair Bonderson, and do we have a second? Second from Commissioner Higgins. Any discussion? I'm not seeing any. So Ms. Fennessy, can we do a roll call vote, please?
Thank you. I'll start the roll call vote. Commissioner Bakke,
Yes.
Commissioner Higgins,
Yes.
Commissioner Lodge,
Yes.
Commissioner Wardlow,
Yes.
Commissioner Wiscombe, Commissioner Wiscombe.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. And Vice Chair Bonderson
Yes.
and Chair Escobedo.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Fennessy. And with that, we will open up public comment to the public for any items that are not on today's agenda.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Chair Escobedo, I just have a question. The motion, I think, was for the January 20th minutes with the revision. And we haven't voted on the January 13th minutes, as far as I know, unless I misheard the motion.
Vice Chair Bonderson, was your motion only for the January 20th minutes?
My understanding was that you were asking for a motion for both of them. So although I didn't make it clear I was responding to you. So if you would like, we can do it separately, but my intention was that we were doing it for both.
And Commissioner Higgins, is that your understanding as well? And you seconded? All right. So both minutes were part of the motion and the second. So we'll move on to public comment for any items that are not on today's agenda. Ms. Fennessy, do we have any members of the public that would like to give public comment on items not related to today's items?
Thank you. And if you would like to make a public comment, please follow the instructions on screen. And we did receive 2 general public comments from Patricia Reyes-Toven and Melissa Haskell, and that was distributed to the commission prior to this meeting. And at this time, I do not see any hands raised, so I'll hand it back to the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Fennessy. So we'll close out preliminary matters and we'll move on to our only item for today. It's a discussion item, item 3, proposed zoning ordinance amendments for housing projects. The Planning Commission will review and provide comments on draft zoning ordinance amendments for housing standards, including open yard amendments, required landscaping, and parking. And I believe we have Ms. Metzger here to give the staff report, and I'll ask that my fellow commissioners turn off their cameras. Hello, Ms. Metzger.
Hi, thank you, Chair Escobedo. Yes, as Chair Escobedo said, we're here today for our second round of presenting to Planning Commission some proposed zoning ordinance amendments for multi-unit housing and single-family housing. Next slide, please. So today I'm here before you to talk about 3 main categories, including open yard amendments, required landscaping, and parking. And in parking, we have some subcategories, including required parking, guest parking, and covered parking. Next slide, please. To start out, I'd like to give you some background on specifically the average unit size density incentive program. So most recently in 2019, Council gave us direction to encourage housing in the AUD program by limiting building size through floor area ratio standards. In 2020, in response to the COVID pandemic, we did some amendments to specific downtown areas, the Central Business District, to expedite building of housing units in that area. And then in June of 2021, Council authorized us to contract with an economic feasibility consultant to look at the new proposed floor area ratio standards and how using them could net us more housing that was affordable in the city. And then in August, Council authorized us to start the process of updating our general plan EIR, and we consulted with Rincon on that, and that's in progress. Additionally, in 2020, we got the direction to start these amendments that are here before you today, taking these standards out of the average unit size density incentive program and looking about how they would kind of feather throughout other portions of code as to where those development standards should live. And then in October of 2021, we presented the results of the economic feasibility study to the Planning Commission. And then in December of 2021, we were before you to extend the AUD program, and it has henceforth been extended by City Council to February of 2024. Next slide, please. So these amendments that we'll be talking about today, proposed amendments, fall under some certain goals for the Community Development Department, including process improvements, clarity, streamlining, flexibility, and objectivity. So in the last slide, I talked about what we have done with the AUD program. But in addition, this effort has wrapped in a couple other work program efforts with it, including edits to the new zoning ordinance, or ENZO. So this was adopted back in 2017. And since that time, we've found certain inconsistencies or things that weren't really carried forward like they should have been through the amendment process of creating that whole new zoning ordinance. And so this is fixing some of those things. Additionally, when the NOVAC study came back, the Land Development Team Oversight Committee was formed to look at how to conclude those recommendations in the City Community Development Department. And so we're also wrapping some of those recommendations into the amendments before you. These primarily are due to streamlining and flexibility in the permitting and zoning process. Next slide, please. Additionally to these items, we also have a constant pressure on jurisdictions in the state from the state government in regards to creating more housing and making objective design standards instead of having subjectively reviewed projects. And so that is also something that we're responding to with the amendments here before you today. And the real purpose of the state continuing to move towards this is simply to further the goal of creating more housing units across the state. So the first amendments that I'll be going over are in regards to the open yard. And the open yard amendments really focus on the process improvements, clarity, flexibility, and objectivity goals of that last slide. So this is the purpose and intent of our open yard section. And so I've highlighted some of the main points on this slide. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see that it's to enhance the beauty and environmental quality of neighborhoods, to increase light and air, offer opportunities to be outside. And finally, the last bullet, to allow flexibility in form and design of open yards. And so that harkens back to the state continuing to move us towards creating more housing by having more flexibility in our zoning ordinances. And these intent and purpose statement is on page 13 of your report in the attachment of the proposed open yard ordinance. Next slide, please. And then looking at the open yard standards, this is where they're applicable. The open yard standards apply to all residential and mixed use development in the city. This is not a change. This is how it is currently in code. There are no significant changes to the open yard requirements for single and 2 unit standards, so we won't really be talking about that in this section. But we are proposing changes to the multi-unit and mixed use developments. And so those are the areas that we're focusing on in the next slides. And those are part of the zoning districts of RM, RMH, OR, CR, CG, MC, and then 2 coastal zoning districts where multifamily is allowed as well. Next slide, please. The next few slides go over what the current standards for open yard are, and they're divided into 2 separate sections. So on the left side of your screen, you'll see the standards for multi-unit zones. So that's the RM and RMH zones from the previous slide. And then the AUD program standards for non-residential zones. So those are the zones that are commercial, office, and manufacturing, mostly falling in our central business district. So you'll see between those 2 different areas in the city, there were different open yard standards, which are currently governing open yard. And there's a lot of different elements to these open yards just in option 1. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that in addition to those elements, we also have a second option that applicants can look at to use for open yard. So once again, for the multi-unit zones, you're on the left side, and for the AUD program in non-residential zones, you're on the right side. In this, you can see that option 2 for the AUD program is a lot more simplified than option 2 for multi-unit or either of the first options on the last slide. And that is like what we'd like to move towards. Next slide, please. And so we are proposing as staff and asking for your opinion on the open yard total area being 15% of the lot area. Now that's just moving forward what was on the last slide of 15% of the lot area being both for multi-unit zones and also for the AUD projects. So that is not really a change. We're just moving that forward. What we are changing in our recommendation is allowing an applicant to look at using a combination of either private open yards or common open yards. On the last slides in your staff report and on the next slide, you'll see that they were required to do certain amount of private open yards and certain amount of common open yards. Looking at the way that trends have been going for open yard across the state in other jurisdictions, private open yards aren't actually as attractive as they used to be in a development, and giving that option to the applicant creates that flexibility that we have been talking about in previous slides. Next slide, please. So the open yard can be met through that private or common areas or the combination of both. That is the only way to meet your 15% of your lot for open yard. But in addition, and in the next section, I have a graphic that goes over this in more depth. Certain parts of that open yard can also meet the landscaping requirements. So there's overlap in the landscaping section, which we'll go over in a couple slides. So the next slide shows our current situation, which you've seen on the previous slides, but in comparison on the table to what we are proposing. And so the area to the left with the white background is what staff is proposing the open yard be for all multi-unit and mixed use developments. So we're proposing that 15% of the lot area. We're allowing them to do a combination of private and common. And then if they choose to do private, we do have minimum dimensions that they have to meet. And if they choose to do common for their requirement, there's also certain standards that have to be met there. As you see with the private area, it used to be on other sides, different dimensions. We didn't carry over the exact dimensions, as well as with the common open yard also. And we looked at these dimensions with the local AIA chapter and spoke with them a couple times via Zoom meetings. And it was expressed to staff that meeting the 15% is fine, that was not an onerous development standard, but the dimensions were a little difficult at times. So we worked with what we heard from those meetings to change the dimensions. But even though those dimensions are changed, the intent of the 15% is carried through from previous standards to the current standard. Additionally, when we were drafting these ordinance amendments, we went out and looked at other jurisdictions in the state to see what they do and if they've had any changes to their open yard standards. And we found that there were a couple jurisdictions that actually allowed a portion of that required percentage to be allowed in an indoor area. And there were various reasons as to why they did that, which are laid out in your staff report. But one of them was that having an indoor area for that common open space would be used during times of intermittent weather or at night when you really wouldn't feel like being in an outside area, instances like that, or used for gym equipment, working out, or meetings of the development. So we put in our recommendation that whatever your 15% of the lot area is, 600 square feet of that could be credited towards the open yard requirement, no more than 600 square feet. So on the next slide, we show the questions for you to go over. And you'll notice that we're asking that question. If you believe that the common indoor area meets the intent and purpose that I went over at the beginning of the open yard standards. So we'll be going over these questions at the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to put them here so you're thinking about them throughout it. So we can move on to the next slide, Ms. Busk. So next we're going on to requiring landscaping. This meets the goals of process improvement, clarity, and objectivity. Next slide, please. So the intent and purpose of the landscaping is shown here on this slide. We're looking at creating a consistent procedure, improving the air quality, stormwater runoff, outdoor water use, protecting environmentally sensitive areas, increasing tree planting to reduce the heat island effect. And then by doing this required landscaping, we're doing an appropriate amount for new development and providing screening and buffers between adjacent uses. When looking at the landscaping standards, again, we went out to other jurisdictions to see what they had codified for landscaping. And that is how staff started to compile these landscaping intents and purpose. Next slide, please. So landscaping is a little different than open yard because currently really no standards exist in Title 30, which is our zoning code in regards to landscaping. The only area that speaks to landscaping is in regards to parking in the parking section of Title 30. And it talks about the landscaping that is required in parking lots. So looking at this, open yards and setback areas are not required to be landscaped. And then at this point in time, you would think that that would be something that you would want to have because you would see from the front setback the development and we would want that to be screened from view at some point. That is done still, even though it's not codified, but it's done through our design review process. So through our Architectural Board of Review or Historic Landmark Commission, the project is reviewed with its landscaping plan. We have design guidelines in those boards' guidelines that talk about what landscaping needs to be. And then on each of those boards, there's one member who's either a landscape architect or has landscaping experience that kind of guides the rest of the board on what should be done in regards to landscaping. And so next slide, please. I spoke a little bit earlier about state trends, and I just wanted to reiterate this here because the real important thing for us to create this landscaping section in our code is because these bills here allow certain projects to not go to the design review boards, to skip the ABR and the HLC and go straight to the permit. And when you go straight to a permit, you only have to follow what is codified in Title 30 and in Title 28 if you're in the coastal zone. And so all they would have to do is follow that landscaping that is spoken about in regards to parking lots. They could propose a project with no additional landscaping, and we would have no teeth, as we say sometimes, to require anything else as staff. Next slide, please. So currently in those design guidelines that the HLC and ABR look at, the language is there for landscaping massing shall provide for a generous overall percentage of plant landscaping in relation to the site and lot hardscape. So as we know, generous is not an objective standard, it's very subjective. And then it also states that paved areas should minimize and planting areas maximized. So next slide, in looking at the goals for why we are codifying landscaping, we want to determine when a landscaping plan is required for a development project, and then identify the areas of the site that must be landscaped. Next slide, please. So our amendment that we're presenting to you today is applicable in the RM, RMH, RS, and R2 zones. So those are the zones where multi-unit is allowed, and also where single unit and duplexes are allowed. This would only become in effect, the landscaping standards, if a new building was proposed, or if it had an addition over 50% or 1,000 square feet, and if the landscaping occurred in a hazardous, highly visible, or environmentally sensitive area. And those areas are actually called out in your ordinance specifically as slopes and other environmental areas. Next slide, please. So we are proposing 15% of the multi-unit lot for that RM and RMH zone be landscaped. And then 20% for the other residential zones, that single unit and duplex zone. For the 20% in the residential zones for RS and R2, they have such a generous front setback that meeting the 20% when we reviewed existing plans really didn't seem like it would be an issue for any of the plans we looked at. And then also it's important to remember when looking at landscaping versus thinking about the last section on open yard, the landscaping doesn't apply to commercial, office, or manufacturing. And so the next slide kind of shows a map of those areas. I'm sorry, it's a little light on my screen. Hopefully you guys can see it better, but the orange or the darker orange are the multi-unit zones. And then the lighter yellow, which is yellow for me, is the single unit and 2 unit zones. And so you'll see kind of that hole in the middle of town, that's the downtown areas that have primarily commercial zoning. And so that's where it wouldn't be applicable. Next slide, please. So this is the areas that are required to be landscaped. That doesn't mean that you can't landscape other places on the lot. This is just what is required to be landscaped. So in speaking before on a slide, I talked about the front setback being important for screening of new development from the street. So obviously the front setbacks are required to be landscaped. And then also if you provide open yard on grade, that is also required to be landscaped. So that is one of the situations where that square footage would count towards open yard and also count towards your landscaping. So that 15% for each. And then also continuing with the parking lot, which is the only existing ordinance for landscaping currently. And then driveways adjacent to on-site buildings or abutting residential properties. So that's just a kind of screening and buffering situation, along with if you're adjacent to non-residential uses and you're in the residential zone. So these are the areas that landscaping is required. And then on the next slide, I can show you. So hold on just a second. Sorry. For some reason, my Zoom just moved. Okay, so open yard and landscaping do have that overlapping. So 15% required open yard must be met in either the private open yard, common open yard, or combination, like we stated. And then 15% of the landscaping requirement can be included in that on-grade common open yard. And so the next slide should show us a graphic of what that means with a hypothetical development here. So you'll see with the darker green area, those are the required landscaped areas. So this is assuming that we have a common open yard on grade. So that's in the back of the parcel. And you can see that half of that common open yard is landscaped. The other half, we're just assuming for this hypothetical situation, might be more hardscape, like in a gazebo or something like that. And so that would not count, or doesn't have to count. And then the front setback also on the street side is landscaped, required to be landscaped, and then the side. And then additionally, if that didn't get you to your 15% of the site being landscaped, you could choose other areas like the interior setbacks that are more of the taupe color on this example. I think we can go to the next slide. So the definition of the landscape is important for these discussions. It is not just your plant material. It is also permeable pathways, stepping stones, fountains, and other ornamental features. And this goes back to the intent and purpose of landscaping. So it's not just the trees that will help us with the carbon offset and heat island effects that trees do, but also the permeable areas that will help with our stormwater situations. So it does both of those things. Next slide. In addition to the standards that we've talked about so far, we also included other sections in our landscaping standards that are included as an attachment to your staff report. And these, we didn't feel the need to get into depth in, and we can talk more about them if you'd like, but there are materials, water conservation, defensible space, tree protection, and tree replacement. And next slide. Over this week, when I spoke to people about the staff report that had come out on landscaping, there was some concern about the tree protection and replacement section in the ordinance. And we just wanted to let the commission know that we moved it directly from the design guidelines. We as staff didn't make any edits to it, specifically because we're not arborists and we don't have the expertise to make edits to it. So we felt just moving it to the landscaping was a better way of doing it. And then also some people had questions about how it was written and if it pertains to all trees. It only pertains to oak and or sycamore trees. So that section of code only applies to those native trees. Now, this wasn't really an issue when we wrote the staff report, so we don't have a question on it, but if the commission feels that we need to refine the tree protection and replacement, we can take that under consideration and find experts to help us with that before we prepare the final ordinance package that comes back to you. Next slide, please. And so these are the questions on the landscaping section. Do you agree with our codification and creating this as the baseline for all landscaping projects? And just a reminder, anything more, of course, can always be done to these standards. If they want to landscape 20% of the project, that's fine. If they want to put in 6 trees instead of the required one, of course, that's okay. This is just the least that you can do on a project. And then when we met with the landscape architects of the community who offered to donate their time to us to talk through some of these issues, we got a lot of help from them in refining what is there before you today. And we'll continue to work with them after this when we are doing the final ordinance as well. But there wasn't really a consensus on trees at all. And it was kind of a lot of different ideas. And so we as staff were hoping that maybe there would be some more public comment on trees and what to do with them and how many for each site. And that might help inform the Planning Commission on giving staff direction on that. So that's question number 2. And then also those landscape architects, we told them we were having this hearing. And so hopefully if they have anything that came up since meeting with them, that we can also get direction from you to either add them or subtract things that weren't effective in their minds based on the public comment. So that's question number 3. And so we can go to the next section, which is parking. So these improvements are for process, clarity, and flexibility. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows how much parking 2 spaces take up in land. And as much 2 spaces and their turning radii can be up to 675 square feet, which could be a 2-bedroom apartment. So what we're trying to show with this graphic, which has actually been used across the country for many years, is that parking could be housing. And we would ask that you keep that in the back of your mind whenever looking at any parking requirements across the city. Parking is also really expensive to put into a development. Back in 2017, we had a study by an economic consultant that gauged the price anywhere between $30,000 to $50,000. And then most recently in reading articles on parking in Southern California, they can be upwards of $65,000 a space. So who actually pays for that parking amount? It gets passed either to the renter or the purchaser of the condominium. So parking not only uses up valuable land that could be housing, but it's also an expense that can increase the cost of the housing itself. Due to these facts, over my career in planning, parking standards have been reduced or eliminated across the US. In 2020, Santa Barbara followed this suit and eliminated the parking requirements in our central business district and made maximum parking. So basically that states that you cannot put more than 1 space per unit in projects in the downtown area. So we have also followed that national trend. Additionally, reducing parking helps with other transportation modes being chosen to be used and helps reduce the emissions caused by vehicles. Next slide, please. So the first part of parking is talking about AUD projects versus other multi-unit housing projects. So if we go to the next slide. So you'll see on the left side of the table, we have the AUD program parking. So this is for rentals only. And that second column down or second row down, you'll see the CBD parking that I just spoke about, or inside the CBD, 0 spaces required. And then outside the central business district in the AUD program, we have 1 space for all units. So that could be a studio, 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom until you get up to 3 or more bedrooms. And then you're required to have 2 spaces. So this is for rentals in the AUD program outside of the downtown. The 2 spaces for 3 bedrooms was put in place in 2019. So it's one of our newest amendments besides the CBD changes in regards to parking. And then on the right side of your table here, we show the parking regulations for condominiums and the area which is USS, meaning Upper State Street. So Upper State Street has an overlay zone. And when the AUD program was created back in 2013, for some reason, the Upper State Street overlay zone was called out to have additional parking standards for any uses built there for multi-unit housing. And so you'll see that inside the Central Business District, it's 1 space per unit. So that's if you build a condo and no guest parking. And then outside the Central Business District, the parking gets pretty big for each unit. So even a studio where you might not even have a car, you might be someone that bicycles everywhere, is requiring a 1.25 of a space. Next slide, please. So this is a map that shows those 2 areas talked about in the last table. So the Upper State Street is the blue, and then the Central Business District encompasses most of the downtown area. Next slide, please. So the Upper State Street overlay has been established in its intent in the zoning code to control non-residential floor area and related traffic in the Upper State Street area. And in my research as to finding why the AUD parking standards were called out specifically different for the Upper State Street area, I really didn't see any correlation or reason for it and couldn't find any real background on why it was included as having increased parking requirements. It does talk about height and floor area, but it doesn't talk about parking in the overlay at all. It's only called out in the AUD section. And so therefore, staff is recommending that the USS overlay not be treated different than any other areas of the city. So on the next slide, I'll show you the proposed standards that we're recommending as staff. So we want to continue the parking standards in the Central Business District, especially since they were just adopted in 2020. And then we want to apply the AUD program parking standards outside of the Central Business District of 1 space per unit across the board. So for all unit types, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. So everything would be the same. 3 bedrooms would no longer have 2 spaces as shown in the current ordinance. And this would apply to all multi-unit housing and mixed-use projects. So that's including condos and rentals and treating them the same, and in all zoning districts. So the next slide shows the questions that we'll ask you at the end of the presentation. And so we want to know if you also believe that condominiums and rental housing should be treated the same. And if you have any reasons why the Upper State Street overlay should be kept at those higher parking standards. And just one thing I forgot to say on the Upper State Street overlay, I looked at other projects that have happened in that zone. And we had Estancia, which went in, I believe, about 4 years ago. And just looking at the development and how much parking it has, just think about how much more housing that could have been if each of those studios didn't have to have 1.25 of a parking space, going up to the other units even having more. So our main concern is creating more housing in this community. And to do that, we are proposing to create parking standards the same for all units in multi-unit and condominium projects. Next slide, please. And next, we'll go over the guest parking requirements. So guest parking is another one of the standards that we're looking at that has been changed at a state level for us. So when the accessory dwelling units ordinances first came into play, we were taking at a state level the garages of many single family units and creating average unit or accessory dwelling units out of them. And so that was taking away the required parking, so the guest parking. And so I don't know, can everyone else see the slides? Because mine just disappeared.
I'm
Same.
sorry, the PowerPoint just quit. I'm gonna get it reloaded for you.
There's no quitting.
No problem.
So while Ms. DeBusk is loading that up, I can talk a little bit more about the guest parking. So in 2013, since the AUD program's inception, guest parking has not been required for rental units built under that program. Now, going back to what we talked about earlier, condominiums and the Upper State Street overlay have a different parking standard. And so guest parking is required currently for condominiums and that Upper State Street overlay.
Ms.
And
Metzger, if I can. Mr. Busk, we cannot see the PowerPoint currently. We see some other windows open.
Thank you for that.
there we go. And Ms. DeBusk, we're on slide 40 now. Perfect, thank you. So on the right side of this table, it shows what the guest parking standards are for condominium and overlay zones. So if you take into consideration the additional parking already required for condominiums in the last section, and then add on one space for every 6 to 7 units and one space per 4 units in projects with 8 or more, you can see how parking just quickly multiplies. Next slide, please. And so, as you can probably imagine, staff finds the current guest parking standards for condominiums and the Upper State Street overlay excessive, but feels that some should be retained for projects outside of the central business district. So what we're proposing to you is kind of splitting the difference, if you will. So we think that outside the central business district, one space per 10 units might be the best thing to do for that guest parking. Just to be clear, this is an increase in what is currently allowed for rental housing, but it evens out for condominium projects. So the next slide shows our questions for the commission on guest parking. So we ask if you agree with eliminating the guest parking, and which is continuing the current standard for the central business district. And then if for some reason you do not agree with the one space per 10 units, maybe we should look at further certain areas of the city that would require guest parking versus other areas outside of just the central business district being called out, or look at parking being eliminated through a discretionary review process. It's probably not the best option through the discretionary review process because at that point in time, most buildings have been pretty vetted and developed. And so a redesign would be required if suddenly more parking was required at that stage. And then the last section of the report today starts on the next slide. So this is in regards to covered parking. And this also comes from the state level. So it applies to single unit and 2-unit development and condominiums. So condominiums are the only multi-unit this applies to. Rentals would not currently be required to have covered parking. And the definition of covered parking is garages and carports. Next slide, please. The benefits of covered parking is that it screens cars from view and could provide extra storage for trash, bicycles, and other things. Next slide. The disadvantage to covered parking are a little more. It increases the cost of housing because it's another structure or an addition to the structure and footprint. It takes land that could be used for additional housing. It's an onerous regulation for the property owner. Maybe they should decide if they want covered parking or not in their development. And it provides less flexibility in those design options. And then per the state continuing to not require covered parking, looks like an antiquated regulation. And as staff on the next slide, we prefer to just leave the idea of covered parking up to the applicant itself. So this is what's required for, yeah, thank you. You can go forward, Mr. Busk. So this is what we are proposing as staff. If you want to put covered parking in your project, in your condominium project, or in your duplex, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But it's important to remember that the parking would still have to be screened. So it's not going to be a bunch of cars in your front yard setback that you'll see because they don't have the covered parking. And so next slide, please. So our questions to you is, do you agree with this? I'm sorry, that bullet actually is wrong. It should be in another place, so please ignore that. And then, do you agree with it for condos as well? So for all single, 2-unit and condos. So that will be our questions to you at the end of the presentation, which is rapidly approaching. So the next slide, you can keep going, Mr. Busk, shows our next steps in this process. So when we're looking at the average unit size density incentive program, we are working on updates to our programmatic environmental impact review or report to the general plan. And so that is a big work effort that we're doing this year. And then additionally, we will continue to work on these code amendments to move the AUD program into other parts of code, along with those LDT oversight committee amendments and the ENZO cleanups. And we imagine coming back to the Planning Commission with a draft of the final ordinances sometime later this year or early next year, depending on what happens at the City Council level on our work program. And so the next slide shows the process for today. I went over this with Chair Escobedo. So I'm in the presentation stage now, and after my presentation, we'll open up public comments. And then Chair Escobedo will ask the Planning Commission questions by topics. So those same questions that you saw before. And then as staff, we can capture each of your answers to those questions. We realize that with open yard and landscape, there may be some overlap, and that's fine because there's overlap in the actual standards themselves. And then after questions, we'll allow Planning Commission to go on to discussion and recommendations. And with that, Chair Escobedo, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Metzger. So we will move to public comment, and I'll welcome my fellow commissioners on screen. And Ms. Fennessy, do we have anyone from the public that would like to give public comment on this item?
Thank you. If you have a public comment, please follow the instructions on screen. And we did receive 5 public comment letters that were distributed to the commission prior to this meeting. And I do see 2 hands raised. And I would like to call on Greg Reitz. I will allow you to talk and unmute yourself, and you have 2 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Chair Escobedo and Planning Commissioners. My name is Greg Reitz. I'm a resident of the San Roque neighborhood and a real estate developer here in town. Generally, I want to support most of the proposed amendments. I reviewed the letter that the AIA submitted, and I support their positions on most of the items. I was under a misunderstanding about the extra parking required for AUD projects outside the CBD, and I think because of the cost, it's going to deter additional housing if you add a requirement for guest spaces for AUD projects outside of the CBD. So if I'm mistaken on that, you can disregard that comment. But the one point I wanted to make is I have looked at one AUD project outside of the CBD that has the full parking at 1 per unit. And that project, the cost, we actually had it bid, was $100,000 per space. It was obviously on the high end of the cost for that kind of project, but if you calculate the monthly cost, it comes out to $450 per space per month. So it's really an impactful amount that has to be passed on to residents if you want to build parking for them in rental housing. So please do keep that in mind as you're considering parking requirements. And then finally, I just wanted to say that this feels a little bit like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We're making little changes here when what we really need is a brand new program to encourage more housing and more affordable housing in town. And I think that is the FAR program. And I hope when that comes back to you, the Planning Commission will support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Ms. Fennessy, are there any other public commenters today?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to call on Detlef Pikerd, and I will send you a mute request. And you have 2 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I'm Detty Pikerd, an architect and principal with RM Design Group. I'm here today representing the Santa Barbara chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and also as co-chair of the AIA SB Advocacy Committee. And we want to convey our very strong support for the effort that your staff has made to simplify and make open yard and landscape standards for multi-unit housing and mixed-use developments more flexible and responsive to the need to promote good design for multi-unit housing. So I just want to, we reviewed the standards and just have a couple of comments that I want to add to that. Number one, we appreciate the flexibility proposed for the open yard alternatives in all multi-unit housing and mixed-use developments. We support the inclusion of a recreation room in the count because it can really improve the quality of life for all the residents. And then with regard to the minimum open yard dimensions, our suggestion there is that we establish one minimum area size and one minimum linear dimension. For example, for balconies, 60 square feet with a minimum of 6 foot dimension, and for minimum dimensions for on-grade open space, you would have a 400 square foot minimum, but with a minimum dimension of 10 feet in any direction. And then that the access to the front door of any unit can be incorporated into that open space. It would not be a separate requirement. And then we really appreciate the ability to deviate, to have staff consider minor deviations from these requirements at an administrative level rather than a full-on modification. I've run out of time, but I wanted to say that we really do support the parking requirements, the guest parking requirements, et cetera, that have been proposed. Again, we really appreciate the staff's having worked on this and really made all these standards much more objective and flexible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pikerd. Ms. Fennessy?
Thank you. We have a couple more hands raised. And I would like to call on Christine Pirion. I'll ask you to mute yourself and you have 2 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Chair Escobedo and commissioners. Appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all. I'm Christine Perone with the Cornell Collective, one of the partners here, and I'll be speaking on behalf of the partners. We do really appreciate the effort that staff has been put into this and how proactive they've been on making these improvements. There's a lot that's really good here, and I would just echo a lot of what Mr. Piker just explained to you and what the AIA's position has been. We are concerned about a few things, though a bit more than the AIA has been. Anytime we create new provisions, such as a 15% landscape provision, it often has unintended consequences that can really limit the opportunity for additional housing. And we've only had a chance since, of course, Thursday to take a look at these proposals, but we would like to make sure that we understand that, as we always say, the devil's in the details, and that allowing this provision to not hinder additional housing will be crucial for us. We do have questions such as, would some of that landscaping be allowed on upper floors? Questions such as that I think we should dig into. We also think that it's really critical, and I appreciate that this was kept out of commercial zones. That has been important to us for creating a lot of our much needed housing stock for our community. So we appreciate that provision. And finally, we were concerned as well with the added guest parking outside of the CBD. We do believe that that will impact the ability to create more housing for our community. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Perone.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Rob Fredericks. I'll ask you to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes to speak.
Good afternoon, Chair Escobedo and Planning Commissioners. Rob Fredericks with the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara. And as an affordable housing provider, developer in the city, we are also very appreciative of staff's work on this effort to provide more flexibilities and certainty in helping to provide more housing at the end of the day that's needed for Santa Barbara. A couple of things I do want to say that we also largely support what's been said by Mr. Piker and the AIA of what's needed. On the landscaping, we also have the same concerns as Ms. Perone was wondering if, my question was if the 15% open space could be, or 15% landscaping could be a subset of the open space. And where we're often building on really small lots that are available with podium parking, we have concerns about the on-grade landscaping requirements. We think the one tree in each front yard is good, and one tree for every 800 square feet of open area is also a good ratio. On the parking, I think staff struck the right balance in their suggestions for parking in the staff report. So that's all I have to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fredericks. Ms. Fennessy, do we have any other public commenters today?
Thank you. At this time, I do not see any more hands raised, so I'll hand it back to the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Fennessy. So as Ms. Metzger laid out, we're going to do a round robin for each of these topics, and we are going to start with questions, and the opening questions will be on the open yard topic. So Vice Chair Bonderson, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we get started, I have a procedural question for you or for staff. Since the parking and the open yard amendment portions are not new to us, they're returning. but the landscape portion is it's the first time we're seeing it. I was interested to know if my fellow commissioners would be willing to consider either a straw poll vote or a separate motion, something that will allow us to separate them in the event that it moves, like we can allow parts of this to move forward without hesitation if we get stuck on something else.
Ms. Metzger, did you want to address that?
Yes, Chair Escobedo and Commissioner Bonderson. So this is just a recommendation. We don't need a vote on anything.
Okay.
And you haven't really seen this parking yet either. This is new. We've just briefly touched on open yards. So yeah.
So just to be clear, the procedural aspect of this is to answer questions, give you recommendations, but we're not slowing you down in any way if we don't come to a particular consensus. Is that correct?
No, and if anything, it gives us more homework to do to, like, instead of one direction, we can look at various options. So we're open to that.
Very good. It's clear to me now. Thank you, Ms. Metzger.
Thank you. And then Chair Escobedo, if Ms. DeBus can put up slide 54, that'll help us with our open yard questions.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to start with questions since I have the mic, or should I get back in queue?
No, I think you can start and start with your questions as it pertains to open yard, please.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. And I know Ms. Metzger mentioned that open yard and landscape overlap quite a bit. I'm going to do my best to keep them as separate as I can, but I might be forced into an overlap here and there. So my first question with regard to open space is the discussion. I grabbed the slide that you showed, but I didn't grab the slide number. If you don't mind putting up the slide that you had shown us with the two existing columns and the proposed open yard column, how they differ, I could start there. It might help on our screen.
That is slide 13, Ms. DeBus.
Thank you, Ms. Metzger. So my first question to staff is, do we have a current minimum square footage for studios?
Through the chair, Commissioner Bonderson, yes. So if you look on the left two columns, the studio square footage can be 60 to 100 square feet. What we don't have is the dimensions of 6 by 10. So that's the difference here.
I'm not sure if I don't think I clarified my question because I was talking about the actual unit itself, not the outdoor space. Did you answer me with regard to the outdoor space?
Yes.
So I'd like to know, I'm sorry about the confusion. I'd like to know if we have a minimum square footage indicated in our municipal code for the actual unit itself. Is there a minimum in our community?
Yes, we have a minimum size for any residential unit, excluding the ones that have shared facilities like bathrooms and kitchens, of 220 square feet.
220 square feet.
And that's actually from the building code.
That's exactly what I wanted to know. And so are we using what we see here on the screen as our minimum, the 60 square feet minimum for that unit if it were to have outdoor space?
I'm sorry, Commissioner Bonderson, what's the question there?
My apologies. What the screen is showing here, private minimum area, 60 square feet. If a studio that's a studio that's proposed at 220 square feet has outdoor space, are we requiring that outdoor space to be no less than 60 square feet?
Yes, Commissioner Bonderson, thank you for that clarification. So
Sorry.
If the developer decides to put in the private area, then it would have to be 60 square feet. And the reason behind that is that's the smallest usable square footage staff thinks. Would a developer want to give a studio half of the studio's size in outdoor area? Probably not. They would probably take that square footage and put it towards the common area. And so that's why we gave them the option, because currently they don't have that choice. They would have to put in some sort of private open yard for a studio.
Thank you for clarifying that. That wasn't exactly clear to me. But in the event that they do choose to have outdoor space of any type, it automatically defaults to the 60 square feet. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do we have any room in our discussion to change that based on the square footage of the unit, making it more relative, maybe making it 15% or 20% or whatever the percent is of the unit should be outdoor space? Have we ever considered that?
So Chair Bonderson, what we've done from the previous two columns next to our proposal is tried to simplify this. And so the more you try to make each standard fit one certain type of development, the more complicated actually putting together a development project becomes. And that is what we've heard from the community, that we don't want to continue to regulate things by bedrooms or by unit type. It's simpler just to have it across the board the same. But you could do that. You could direct us to.
Okay, I'll leave that for deliberations and discuss that, make that into a discussion. But I just wanted to know what our history is. And based on our conversation that we had about this column exactly, you made it very clear that we now have the ability to do combinations. And this yellow column is showing us what those combinations could look like using either square footage of private and common to get the overall. My question is, and this might be another deliberation point, but you're providing, or staff is providing minimum dimensions here. We see 6 feet for the private, we see potentially 15 feet, 10 feet, and 15 for common. I'd like to know if there has ever been the removal of the dimensions considered and just the square footage as a goal to give more creative opportunity and flexibility to that outdoor form?
Yes, Commissioner Bonderson. So we have always had the dimensions in some sort as part of the standard. What we haven't had always is square footage. So looking at the dimensions and the past plans that we pulled up to do this analysis, there are developments that provide a private yard of 4 feet by 10 feet. That's fine, but that doesn't count towards the 15% of the lot area. And our opinion on that as staff is that that's not necessarily a usable area for that unit. And it should be somewhere where they can meet the intent of open yard again. And just to give you the keywords for that, it's areas for recreation and leisure, opportunities for gardening, trees, and landscaping, and encourage social interaction. So if you have something less than 6 by 10, we don't think it meets that intent.
Commissioner Bonderson, if I could just add a little bit more history. Under Title 28, the city did have an option to provide open yard where you provide your private open yard, you provide all your required setbacks. And then in addition to that, you have to provide 10% of the lot as open space. And there were no dimensional requirements associated with that 10%. Often what we saw were these tiny 3-inch strips or 6-inch strips that would be here, there, and those would technically count. Did they provide it much benefit? Maybe not. But the standards were written very differently, right? Because we did not count setbacks, whereas now we would count the setback, but we have a larger dimensional requirement. So there are a lot of different ways to go about doing it. And we've tried out a lot of them actually over the years, so.
Thank you, Mr. Busk. That actually makes it a lot easier to understand the direction you're all going. I have a question, speaking of history. I was thinking about, and spoke with Ms. Metzger about this, the concept of the Juliet balconies, about giving an opportunity to smaller units to have an ability to open doors, whether they're French doors or some sort of door, and stepping out, even if it's not used for recreation, per Ms. Metzger's recent definition, the one she just read. That obviously it conflicts the definition. My interest is to know if there's room for us to redefine that definition to accommodate more opportunities, to allow outdoor space per unit for the private portion, but to deviate from the concept of what we're defining that use to be.
So Commissioner Bonderson, if you don't agree with the dimensions here, it is in your purview to request changing or eliminating dimensions in our response to questions.
Very good. Okay, I am now clear on how we can proceed. Mr. Chair, I would like to come back, get myself a little bit more organized because I have other questions, but I don't want to hold everyone up.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you,
Thank
Vice
you.
Chair.
Thanks.
Are there any other commissioners with questions on open yard? No, I'm not. Oh, Commissioner Higgins.
So just to be clear, and sorry if this is there, but it's just not jumping out at me, but can I use my setbacks? Can I combine the setbacks with my open yard?
So Commissioner Higgins, your side setback can also have your open yard that's private in it. So your balcony can go into that setback.
So if I have
yes.
if I have a 10-foot setback running along the side of my property, that area of the setback can be used for my open yard as well?
It can be used if you're using the private open yard option or the common open yard option. So you can have a portion of that common on grade or on grade private into the setback, but the entire row of the setback cannot be open yard because it doesn't meet the intent. Just if your open area intrudes into that setback, it's counted.
Okay. And then I can't, the intent of the code here is to not allow an applicant the ability to call a setback area both the open yard and a landscape area all in one?
Right. This open yard cannot just be the whole strip of your side or rear yard setback, but it can be part of your landscaping percentage.
Is there, was there any discussion internally, either with you, within the department or with the other stakeholders about having an applicant be able to call it one, use setback as open yard as landscaping?
When we look at, so we're talking about open yard first. So I'm talking about open yard. When we look at open yard and the intent of open yard, if you have a 5-foot setback running along the whole side of the parcel, it doesn't really meet the intent of a recreational opportunity, but it does meet the intent of landscaping because it's a buffer area between the lots. And so that's why it counts towards landscaping, but not towards open yard unless it's part of your actual open yard, square of the private open yard or common open yard.
Got it.
And I have a graphic that I'll show, or I did show, we can go to that too, if that's more helpful.
That's okay, I get it.
Okay.
I may come back to that exhibit. I appreciate that exhibit, but those are my questions right now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Commissioner Wardlow?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Metzger. This has been a very informative conversation and I really appreciate it. Overall, I'm really supportive of a lot of the components mentioned now, but I'd love it if you could give an overview of the pros and cons of why you've proposed a potential for an indoor recreational room to take over part of the requirements from an outdoor yard requirement space.
Yes, of course, through the chair, Commissioner Wardlow. So when we looked at those other jurisdictions that had allowed a certain part of the open yard requirement to be satisfied by a certain square footage of indoor recreation, there were a variety of reasons that they listed as to why that was something you could do. So one of the reasons is that actually when you're developing a project that has a multitude of different unit types, you have these pockets of areas that aren't always able to be used as one or the other of the units. And so they kind of end up kind of open areas. And so it could be used for that instead of being kind of swallowed up by the building. Additionally, and probably more importantly, at least from my perspective of it, is it's an area that you can go to as a resident that is not actually exposed to the elements. So I don't know how many people were outside this morning, but it was really cold. And so that doesn't happen very much here. I will be the first to admit we have the most beautiful weather in the state. But if it's raining or if it's cold or if we have strong winds, you might not be able to use the area as a recreational opportunity outside. It might be unpleasant. And so having this indoor escape is something that could satisfy you during that time. And then the detriments to having that area as part of your open yard are that it could be seen as an amenity to the property. So if they threw a treadmill in there and an exercise bike, would they possibly advertise that as an in-gym for the development? And could that increase the rent prices? Probably yes. So the reason that staff put this in the staff report is because we saw both examples, and we wanted to see what the Planning Commission felt was more important, I guess.
Great, thank you for that overview. Another question I have is, I was excited to see the work that you all have done in terms of streamlining and empowering a decision maker, quote unquote, to allow for slight changes in the project. Just love to go over kind of how you got to that point and why you decided to do this, as well as, you know, where we can look for more streamlining decisions like this in other staff reports or throughout this. But I do really want to commend you, Jessica, for your work on this, because I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. It's definitely a group effort through our entire planning department to look at ways to streamline our processes. And one of those is to look at extraneous process that are cumbersome to anyone developing in the city. And so part of that is, if a variation is slight, 10% or less, does it really necessarily have to go through the whole process again? Or can we look at it as the experts in our field and determine that it's acceptable or not acceptable? And then if not, then it could go through the larger process. And so as part of that land development team oversight committee recommendations, we're looking at larger projects as well, besides just these small sections of landscaping and open yard, to further find things to tune up to make it a simpler process. And so that includes looking at minor zoning exemptions and what's required there. And so we will be working on those packages through the next year and probably presenting some of those to you as well when we have them in a form that's ready for you.
Wonderful, thank you. That's the remainder of my questions, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. Additional questions from the commission on open yard? All right, I'm not seeing any. So I don't have any questions either. And with that, we'll move on to landscaping. Are there any questions on landscaping requirements? Vice Chair Bonderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was trying to let someone else have first dibs on questions here. Oh, Ms. Wiscombe just popped up. I should have let you go first. May I do that? May I just allow her to go first?
If Commissioner Wiscombe or Commissioner Balke would like to go first, but Vice Chair, you have the floor here. I think it's okay if you go first.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll go ahead and put a few questions out there then. My first question has to do with a request for some clarification that that is on the slide that Ms. Metzger used, the zoning map that had the yellow and the orange and the empty space for downtown.
Slide 23, please, Mr. Busk.
Thank you, Ms. Metzger. As it's being pulled up, my question is, you mentioned that the space that's considered commercial in the downtown area was just left blank. There's no color attached to it. What ordinance currently applies to the downtown residential units that are in that bubble of space that's not currently colored in?
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner Bonderson. So this landscaping ordinance is a brand new ordinance. Nothing currently is in the zoning code related to landscaping except for those parking lot areas. And this zoning ordinance that we're proposing to you would only be applicable in single unit, 2-unit, and multi-unit zoning districts.
Right.
So the difference between this and open yard is applicable to all residential developments. So it's encompassing everywhere where that is allowed. This area in the middle of downtown is commercial primarily. It also has a little office and manufacturing. And so it's still required to have the open yard of 15%, and that's not proposed to be changed. But we're not looking at requiring landscaping there for the most part because it doesn't have required setbacks in the majority of it. And most of the developments we've seen through the AUD program are built lot line to lot line. And so they don't have the opportunity to have any in-ground landscaping. So they provide open yard through roof decks or private patios. And neither of those count as landscaping either. It has to be on ground. And I think that should answer your question.
It does. And I'm going to build one more question out of it. We are obviously seeing many the interest of taking certain commercial structures or other type of uses and converting them to housing. If that happens in this area that currently doesn't have the amendments that we're discussing here today, doesn't have these amendments applicable to them, how are we handling those requirements? Are they elsewhere in the code for conversion projects?
So Commissioner Bonderson, at this point in time, we don't have an adaptive reuse ordinance. We were before you in November of last year looking at what that would be. And part of the recommendations that we received from your commission was to waive the open yard requirement for adaptive reuse if there was no opportunity for it to further incentivize using these existing buildings that often don't have any room for open yard or for parking, for that matter.
Thank you. And I'm going to go one step further. I promise it's the last question having to do with this. But if we don't look at it as adaptive reuse, let's say somebody wants to completely convert the site, demo the structure, and start again. Do we have the open yard or the landscaping requirements in a format currently that would be applicable to that zone, to that area on the map?
Yes, Commissioner Bonderson, open yard would be applicable to new development if they demolish the building and rebuilt it. There's nothing for landscaping unless they were putting in a parking lot. And then there's certain standards for parking lot landscaping. And then also, just so you know, if it's an existing building currently, they can get a modification to the zoning map amendment, which goes before the hearing officer. And that would be how they get a reduction in their open yard requirement if they can't satisfy that on site.
Excellent. Thank you for the clarification and for the reminder on how we moved forward back in the fall last year. All of that was really important for us to hear. My other question has to do with the concerns that came up during public comment. I actually have the same concern. I wrote it down in my notes and then wanted to make sure that it gets addressed once I heard few of the public commenters bring it up. It's the question about if landscaping may be considered on levels that are not on grade. We're currently requiring it to be on grade per this amendment language. Is there room for us to discuss or recommend other options?
Yes, Commissioner Bonderson, the commission could discuss other options, but I would just like to remind you that these areas are the RM zones. And so they're not the downtown area where you're hindered by those developments that are built on podium parking most of the time. And they often, the AUD projects that we looked at for this have in-ground areas of landscaping that were required through the design review process.
Thank you. And I'm also interested in a comment that was made because, as you remember, it was something you and I spoke about, how hardscape, or maybe not necessarily hardscape, but we can call it permeable hardscape, that include things like pathways to front doors and other access opportunities. Can we clarify the language to allow that type of pathway to count in landscape? And if so, does it have to be exclusively permeable?
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner Bonderson. So the definition of landscaping is both hardscape like permeable pathways, courtyards, fountains, and the plant material. So if that path is permeable, it would count towards landscaping. But I just want to be clear, you still would need to satisfy ADA requirements for accessibility, which would most likely be a concrete pathway to it, and that would not count towards your landscaping.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the explanations and the clarification. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Balke, questions on the landscaping?
Yeah, we just got a couple of questions, and this may be a case of I'm sort of a newbie here. Does the existing landscape requirements include public realm landscaping, street tree spacing, and street tree types?
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner Balke. So currently, we do not have anything that addresses street trees or the area between the sidewalk and the road in our zoning ordinance, but that is covered through another ordinance outside of zoning. And we actually have a whole division or section, I can't remember which one it is, of Public Works that deals with street trees. And we have a street tree master plan document also. So that's what governs that area.
Okay. The next question I have is, and I think Commissioner Bonderson touched on it, does our landscape requirements get into low impact development, bioretention, biofiltration? Are those standards promulgated in our landscape standards?
Yes, Commissioner Balke, at this point in time, we kept our landscaping standards very simple, but we're lucky because we have a stormwater division that reviews each permit and has very specific standards in a different part of code that govern your stormwater retention and permeable areas and all of those things. So we believe it's currently covered. I know that they actually are higher than what the state requires for Santa Barbara.
Okay. Thank you. Those are the only two questions I have, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Balke. Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Metzger, for your presentation. I just had a couple things. First of all, just you and I went over this and you answered my question. Thank you very much via email, but I just kind of want to get it on the record. And that's on page 6 of 22 under proposed standards. Landscape plan will be required when landscaping occurs in hazardous, highly visible, and environmentally sensitive areas. So we all know what environmentally sensitive areas are, but could you just describe the hazardous, what that includes, And I had asked you the question about, does it include floodplain areas? And you had answered, no, it doesn't, but hazardous and highly visible, just for the record.
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner Wiscombe, excuse me, while I turn to my other monitor, I'm just going to read it directly. So we were paraphrasing our actual proposed ordinance there. So the hazardous areas would be landscaping or grading within 50 feet from the top of a coastal bluff or 25 feet from the top of a creek bank or on slopes of 30% or greater.
Okay, and are you reading from a definition section that we don't have? Is that what you're reading from?
No, Chair Wiscombe, it's on page 17 of your packet. It's under B3 under landscaping's proposed
I
ordinance.
see it. Okay, great. Yeah, I've got it now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And actually that takes me again to page 17 and I was looking at B1. And talking about when a landscape plan is required, applicability, all newly constructed buildings or when existing buildings are demolished and substantially redeveloped. And what about existing buildings that are partially demolished and have a substantial redevelopment of over 50%, which is really one of the definitions that's a key in our local coastal program update. And I'm wondering if maybe when existing buildings are demolished or substantially redeveloped in accordance with the definition that we have, maybe that word "and" should be changed to "or."
Yes,
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, Commissioner Wiscombe, as we spoke about, I believe that it should be "or" as well. So that was a good catch in the ordinance there, and we'll correct that.
Okay, that's great. I just wanted to make sure that you hadn't had another conversation that changed your opinion on that. So, okay, and I think that's no, I think that's all I have. I wanted to go back to Commissioner Bauke's question because I wanted to make sure that I understood it. I think, and maybe he could respond to it. I think he was asking about the public right-of-way, the parkways and things like that. Is that what you were asking about, Commissioner Bauke, when you were asking the question about street trees? Because they belong in our parkway areas in the public right-of-way.
Right. Yeah, I was discussing basically from building frontage to and basically what's called the public realms. You know, basically the public property and the frontage in front of the building. That's how a lot of cities do it. And I noticed there is a reference to street trees in the landscape standard, part 6 of the ordinance you were referencing in chapter 22.44, but there's no cross-referencing to anything like what the streets tree plan is or anything like that, which is what I was concerned about. Is it leaves it sort of ambiguous as to what it is. It's subject to a whole nother process. And the same thing with the biofiltration comments is it's sort of off somewhere else, but not integrated into the landscape requirements.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that that was what you were asking. Yeah, we do have a whole, we have a street tree advisory committee when projects come up. They go out and look at the street trees. They're all they're appointed by Parks and Recreation Commission, and then whatever their recommendations go to Parks and Recreation Commission for their approval, and then they can be appealed to City Council. So, and there's a whole section on street trees and setback trees and how they're regulated. So I don't remember exactly what section that is, but I just wanted to make sure I understood your question. So that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Additional questions from the commission? All right, I just have one, Ms. Metzger. So with these landscape requirements, what role would the design review boards play into what ultimately comes out on the other end? Is there still going to be some input from the design review board?
Yes, Chair Escobedo. So what will happen is the plans will come to the design review board with these required landscaping areas. And then they can still deliberate on certain aspects of it that are not codified and make determinations based on that.
Okay. That was the only question I had. Any other questions? I'll hold for a few seconds. I'm not seeing any. So let's go to parking. And I see Commissioner Wiscombe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I forgot to mute myself. I was ruffling papers. I apologize. Yeah, I was unclear, Ms. Metzger. I was kind of confused. You had, the staff report states that you want to go to the AUD parking for all our projects outside the CBD, right? Our AUD requirements. Where is the table for parking? Let me get there first.
We can go, Mr. Best, to page 34, please.
Yes, slide, yeah.
Slide.
Great. Yeah, okay, great. So it says here, staff is recommending that the AUD program parking standards be applied to all, oh, we lost it, all multi-unit housing outside the CBD. We just lost the slide, but I don't know if we can get it back again, but it was slide number 30. So my question is, you said that 2 spaces were required for 3+ bedroom units, and that was a 2019 amendment. But then I heard you say in today's presentation that staff is recommending only 1.
Yes, through the chair, Commissioner Wiscombe, after meeting with the commissioners, we realized it wasn't clear what we were recommending for larger units. And we were recommending that all units be treated equally as 1 space per unit outside of the central business district.
Okay, so you're eliminating the 2 spaces and changing that, just standardizing it for any, okay. That's what I didn't understand. Okay, and
yeah, it wasn't clear. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. It just it didn't agree with what I had seen as your recommendation, and I think that's my only question. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Additional questions from the commission on parking? Commissioner Wardlow.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One question. When we talk about changing the CBD requirements and going to a much lower parking, possibly 0 parking in some of these, has staff inquired about an ability to require or figure out if potential renting tenants do or don't have cars? Like, is there a way for us to use this opportunity to say, okay, if we want to develop more land in downtown Santa Barbara, these residents are not going to have cars because we're planning for a future of a more, environmentally friendly, as well as, the future of autonomous vehicles and how cities are smart cities and changing for those types of future things. Is that an option? I know that with the housing authority, you have the ability to check in if the individual has a car or not. And is that something that we could be exploring here?
Yes, Commissioner Wardlow. So the housing authority is able to regulate their tenants and what they have for modes of transportation, because they have on-site managers who can track that. As a city, we don't have the option to do a requirement of a rental agency for a property to track those things for us currently in ordinance. But what we did when we went and made the central business district not have a parking requirement is we looked at other jurisdictions and downtown areas and realized that we're actually at a better state than a lot of places as far as if you still have a car and want to live downtown, you have other options. So we have parking garages that are only half full the majority of the evenings. So we started in 2020 a program to rent spaces if you had a car. And also we unbundled the parking from the development. So if a development says they want one space per unit, they don't have to necessarily have it tied to each unit. They can have the space rented separately than the unit. And then additionally, a long time ago, we increased our bicycle parking on site requirements, kind of taking the space of those parking requirements with indoor rooms that are secure for anyone that has alternative modes of transportation like biking.
Commissioner Wardlow, just one additional consideration is that the Housing Authority has access to DMV records. So they can actually confirm if potential renters own a car, whereas most other people don't have that ability. So it does give them a lot more, a better way of monitoring that rather than, having an unexpected situation.
Yes, and of course, I am aware of that. I'm more thinking of it, is this a conversation that we have with the developers up front, right? If we're all talking about how to have a more green future and how to plan for that city, is this just an opportunity where we could say, is there an example where developers have said, 30% of these are going to go to people that don't have a car, so that we ensure that we're not oversaturating our public parking spaces and street parking by not having any required parking. Just wondering if it's an option or if we've discussed that with developers. I've had a few conversations with you all offline about, how we can better position ourselves with those discussions.
Yes, and Commissioner Wardlow, one thing that we have done with the AUD program since its inception is require a survey of the rental agencies and the tenants. The survey collects data in regards to what and how many modes of transportation they have. So if they have cars, how many? If they have bicycles, how many? If they walk, where do they walk to? It also collects rental information and square footage information. This was a really great idea to start out to collect data on the AUD program, but it's been really hard to implement. And there's a variety of reasons involved in it. One is we can get the information from the rental agencies, even though some of them have turned over every year for the last 3 years. So we have to track them down. It takes a lot of staff time. But then getting the tenants to tell the rental agency to then report it to staff just becomes a real difficult situation. It's like being a telemarketer. I'm calling them over and over, please send me your data. It's just, there's no teeth to make it happen. And it's unfortunate, but we do have some data collected from it.
Well, thank you for your time exploring these options and trying to figure out how to best balance all of it.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. Vice Chair Bonderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a follow-up question on something Commissioner Whitcomb brought up, and I want to make sure that I'm clear. I just spent the last few minutes looking for it, and so I'm not exactly confident I found it. She asked for clarification on how the ADU program parking, let's call it structure or setup, has been proposed to be applied in this case. Did I understand that answer was yes? Did I understand that correctly?
So the proposed standard is on slide 37, and we are continuing with the parking standards in the central business district. And then we're applying the AUD program parking standards outside of the central business district, but only one space per unit. So we as staff, and this is something that of course we want to hear your opinions on during recommendations, believe that for that simplicity goal that we talked about earlier on, just having one space per unit would be effective for the parking. And then also keeping in mind that for those larger projects, they would, if we go forward with guest parking, be required to have one guest parking space per 10 units.
Got it. And so will there be a removal outside of the CBD? Will there be a removal of parking required if the property is located within half mile of transit?
Additional incentives to parking, you mean, Commissioner Bonderson?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm always I'm always thinking this through as I'm speaking, so I apologize if I'm not clear. The ADU program has a part that exempts the unit being created to have parking if the property is within half mile of transit. Is that condition being applied here as well?
Commissioner Bonderson, no, the average unit size or the accessory dwelling unit standard is not applied here yet. If you apply for a multi-unit project under state density bonus, one of your concessions, if you're close to transit, like you said, could be a further reduction in parking.
Okay, but it's not being required today on this amendment. The amendment we see here doesn't include that. I'm clear now. Thank you very much. And that's all I had to ask. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Any other questions from the commission? All right. Vice Chair Bonderson? Oh. Ms. Metzger, I have I guess just a question is, as we reduce our parking requirements, are we also coordinating with other departments or teams in the city that are hopefully thinking about what transportation could look like in the future? We have multimodal options, we have the bus options, but not everyone's going to hop on a electric bike. Are we also planning for that so that as these projects come to fruition, there are multiple options for someone if they don't have a car?
Yes, Chair Escobedo, sorry. We actually work in tandem with the Transportation Department on these parking requirements, and Ms. Swanson is here and she can talk about the review that they have of the standards, including that bicycle parking that I spoke of earlier for developments. And then she might know more about it, but they're continuing to work on the bicycle master plan and looking at where best to place that. I'll let her talk more about what they do to help continue on our alternate modes of transportation.
Thank you.
Hi, Chair Escobedo. And yes, I just wanted to also mention we're in the middle of a traffic model update currently. So that will also tie in with opportunities to look at parking policies and how those might need to be updated or changed with looking at the relationship of managing traffic congestion and also how it relates to parking. So that, and also as part of the State Street Master Planning effort, we will likely be looking at other policies that could affect parking, like on-street pricing again. So we're always looking at the connection to parking policies and also traffic congestion management and how those two play together. Did you have a specific, sorry, could you ask the question about bike parking or bike infrastructure?
I guess, are we planning for alternate modes of transportation in the future? So if we're building projects without parking, one of the questions that we get a lot is, how am I going to get around to the things that I need to do in my day-to-day life without a car? And we have one now, so we have B-Cycle. If someone has a bicycle, they can ride around. But what if you don't ride a bike? What if you have to take a stroller or something like that? Have we worked on planning for that future?
Chair Escobedo, we are always working on capital projects, and we do actually have quite a few coming very soon to construction for both bicycle and pedestrian improvements specifically. So one of them is the West Side Community Paseos project, and one is called the East Side Community Paseos project. Both just looking to fill the gaps of connectivity, biking and walking. And then, as you mentioned, we are continuing to expand bike share locations. So always looking to add more docks where there's demand and fill in those gaps as well. So hopefully that it's a
Yeah.
broad answer, but yes, we have many projects in the pipe to address alternative modes of transportation.
And I imagine working with MTD as well to increase service.
We
Is
do
that
work-
also one?
We do work with MTD as well, yes, and look at service needs with them. So,
Okay.
yes,
Thank you, Ms. Wilson.
sure.
I do not believe that I have any other questions. Vice Chair Bonderson, do you have additional questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I apologize. I forgot one of my questions. I wanted to know what is the current practice in the CBD at the moment of offering parking in nearby parking structures for properties that are in downtown that may not be offering or don't have enough on-site parking?
Take that one.
Thank you.
So you may request for a parking pass, and I could get more specifics from our downtown parking staff on that. But we look at the capacity of the lots and how full they currently are, and if there is capacity to offer a pass, then that is an option for an individual to request at this time. So it just depends. It's site specific. Some of the lots are definitely more impacted than the others, of course. And so there's just not room available, but in the ones that are, that is an option.
Got it. And so there are some that are at full or almost full capacity because of this option?
I believe 85% capacity is the threshold that downtown parking usually looks at for whether or not there's room to offer that or not.
Thank you. And my follow-up question on that is, as we work towards reducing required parking outside of the CBD, I assume that we are leaning towards on-street parking, and there's less restriction on how many hours in a day you can park in an on-street parking spot. Do we have any data on how or where people park when they don't have on-site parking available in apartments and condos and such outside of the CBD?
Commissioner Bonderson, I'm not aware that that's been studied closely at this point in time. It's definitely something we could look at. I know that we do get requests sometimes to the downtown parking staff for example, residential parking permits in areas where it's not an option. For example, some of that has come in as an anticipation of projects that aren't yet on the ground, and residents might be concerned that that's coming. So I know that's occurred in some areas, but more informally, less formally. So I'm not aware of data that exists, though, concrete data about overflow parking from developments outside of the CBD at this point. So it's something that could be looked at.
Thank you. And my final question, I'm not sure who it will go to, but my interest is to understand how ADA, handicapped parking, works. Is it a state mandate or is it a local decision on how many spots are required by law to be on each type of site?
I'm happy to take that one. Jessica or Allison, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. That is not a local requirement. So we are implementing state and federal requirements for accessible parking. And if no parking is provided on site, then no accessible parking needs to be provided on site. But if any parking spaces are provided, then you have to provide a certain number of accessible parking spaces.
Mr. Busk, let me keep you while you're here. Is there any language at the state level that tries in any format whatsoever to promote parking for those who need it when we're removing parking around the city?
Vice Chair Bonderson, I'm not aware of it, but that is definitely not my area of expertise. We could follow up with building and safety staff if that's something you're interested in.
Very good. Thank you very much. I will probably ask this again in the future since this is not the first time I've asked it. So perhaps I'll follow up with you and get the answer for all of us to know next time. Thank you, Mr. Busk. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes my questions for now.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Are there any additional questions from the commission on parking? All right, I'm not seeing any. We're at the 2-hour mark, and so I think it's a good time to take a little bit of a break. So we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll get back here, we'll say 3:11 on the dot. And we are on recess. Planning Commission meeting at 3:11. I'm going to ask the commissioners to come online when they're back. And Ms. Metzger, if you could come back online and just so that if you could give us a rundown of how you would like us to go through the questions and comments portion of today's meeting.
Yes, Chair Escobedo. So if possible, I would like us to start on slide 54, Ms. DeBusk. And that is the questions on open yard. So there's 2 questions, and I'd like each commissioner to give me their answer to each of those questions, and then move on to the next slide so I can easily keep track of all of the recommendations and answers.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Metzger. So to the commission, who would like to go first on answering the questions on the screen? Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just start it out. The first question, are the proposed changes to allow more flexibility in open yard requirements acceptable for multi-unit and mixed use? And I believe that staff has devised the requirements suitable to that. I was looking for I think that the requirements are clear and they give developers flexibility for open yard. I looked at the general plan policies, which was, I think, the last page of our staff report. And they meet the LU goal, LG 5.2, LG 13, and all those 3 specifically, and more of them, I think, support these open yard policies. And then question number 2, does the common indoor area meet the intent and purpose of open yards? I am challenged by this. I understand the pros and the cons of having an indoor area, but I think if you go back and you look at the general plan policies, which talk about open space, I don't think that common indoor areas really meet the intent of our general plan policies. They could probably give the developer more flexibility. I would prefer to see that as perhaps a ministerial approval for these areas that Ms. Metzger stated were, maybe leftover areas where open yard could be applied to them because they can't be developed for anything else. But I really think that these should be really outdoor areas. The staff report on page 3 states that the city's general plan and design guidelines recognize the necessity for generous open space and landscaped areas in development projects. And I don't really think that these indoor areas meet the general plan and design guidelines for that. If my fellow commissioners like the idea of open yard, of indoor areas for open yard, I'd like to see it smaller than 600 square feet. So you do get a credit for it, but it's a minimal credit towards your open yard requirement of 15% of the lot area. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Vice Chair Bonderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will also follow Commissioner Wiscombe's setup and answer the questions and then provide a little bit of additional comment. So first and foremost, I believe that the direction that staff is going has certainly without doubt allowed for more flexibility in the open yard requirement. I'm very pleased to see the direction we're going in. I don't think we're quite there yet, and I'd like to provide a few recommendations. And if my fellow commissioners are interested in either agreeing or not agreeing with it, I think that would be important for us to also comment on so that staff knows what to consider. And also, does the common indoor area meet the intent? I'll answer that one in a moment, but I will go down in my comments and start by saying, I think with the discussion of the definition of open space provided by Ms. Metzger earlier in the hearing, the private open yard definition should be updated so that it's different than what is currently under the purpose. That's A3 under 30.140.140. It conflicts a little bit with the direction we're trying to go. And the reason I say that is because private open yard and common open yard have very different purposes. And so discussing how private open yard is being used has to change with the kind of new, smaller, affordable housing options that we are putting forth in our community. We can't expect that a 300 square foot studio has a 60 square foot balcony. It just doesn't align. I believe very strongly that it needs to be more relative to the size of the unit. And I understand perfectly well that it becomes more complicated if we have to define that. As Ms. Metzger mentioned, I completely respect that point of view, but I don't want to just skip over this. I think it's very important for us to provide that type of flexibility so that smaller studios do get open space, but maybe they don't get the same amount of open space. I'm a big advocate for the Juliet balconies, having the opportunity to perhaps have French doors or some style of sliding door that opens and you can step out and have a very small outdoor space to put some plants, maybe sit and drink a coffee. It doesn't have to be a place to entertain, but it is beautiful and supports light and air and gives opportunities for those smaller units to actually have access to the outdoors. A really good example of that is the Baylor Building by Julia Morgan, which is located on Anacapa between Carrillo and Canon Perdido, just across from the parking structure that the Libero uses, the Libero Theater. And you can see there that they have Juliet balconies on the lower levels. And as you go higher, the top level has a much deeper balcony and several of the doors, the French doors, most likely attached to it. So they're getting the length. I'm guessing that it's not 6 by 10. I think that's probably narrower, just looking from the street level. But you know, maybe it's 5 by 12, but you're still getting your 600 square feet. And I think that that should be an option. I think flexibility there, depending on a site per site constraint, should be considered. And if that's something that staff can speak to and say that they do ministerially evaluate those type of options without an additional modification, then perhaps that would be something that would be really useful to put into our code. Now, I'm going into detail and I don't, you know, want to go too much further. Maybe this is another conversation for another time, but I do really feel that it's important that this option be an administrative decision versus a modification. I believe that it will also help support the ease of adding additional affordable housing as far as, and also other shapes and sizes of housing to our community. And our goal here really is to make the process easier, to make it more supportable, and hopefully to make less work for staff if it's all written in the code, so they don't have to always go in and do unique decisions on every single proposal coming in. With regard to the second question on the screen, I actually really appreciated hearing more about the recreational space that's found indoors, whether it's a gym or some other type of rec room. Ms. Metzger shared some history about that with me, and also in the presentation that they are looking at this in other jurisdictions and that it seems to be working in other jurisdictions. I believe that if we do choose to go in this direction, then the definition again should be redefined so that the definition under the purpose 1A3 is able to cover and clarify the different options and the direction that we're going. And I also would recommend that we perhaps add a maximum indoor area so that it's very clear that you can't have all of your open yard in a covered space indoors. Ms. Wiscombe touched on this in a different way, excuse me, Commissioner Wiscombe touched on this in a different way, and I completely agree with her with regard to how, if we choose to go forward with that indoor recreational space, that it really, really needs to be defined with a square footage and clarification that makes it very clear that it does not accommodate or achieve the goals of the open yard. We need outdoor open yard. We live in such a beautiful place. We want to maintain that. And lastly, I want to just touch on the open yard concept provided on multiple levels. I know that open yard allows this, and at the moment landscape does not. And because this is a overlapping concept, maybe I need to talk about it in the landscape section, but I'll just drop it here and come back to it later. I strongly believe that it needs to be considered that the open yard, wherever the open yard can be found, that landscape should be encouraged and welcomed as well, and therefore the two should count towards one another equally. And that's it. That concludes all my comments. I had a lot, but I appreciate the time. Go ahead, back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Lodge? Commissioner Lodge, you're still on mute.
My apologies to everyone. I had hidden, my screen was hidden. On question one, generally I am in agreement with what the direction staff is going. As the architect on one project that came before the Planning Commission, well, it's been a while ago now, but it said open yard is incredibly important. It's people's opportunity to be in what part of what makes Santa Barbara special. And on one, I do have some concerns about this is on page 5 of 22, the chart showing table A, existing versus proposed open yard standards. The private open yard has a minimum of 6 by 10, which I do. It may be a bit out of scale with a micro unit, but it's still it's about all you can have. If there are 2 people that want to be outside, it's kind of a minimum. So to go to 10 by 10 for common open yard on an upper level seems too small to me. If you're, that would be assuming that it's at least 2 people, and if it's common and there are people from other units that are in it utilizing it, it's going to be 3 or 4 or maybe 5, and the 10 by 10 does not seem an adequate amount of space. On question 2, does the common indoor area meet the purpose of open yards? Absolutely not, as far as I'm concerned. I think we sometimes forget what the importance of the urban forest is to us, to the city of Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is a place that's been a tree city for decades, Tree City, USA. And when you are on a hill looking down, where like Santa Barbara, you mostly see trees. Even when you're on a street looking up, you mostly see trees. And they give so much to us beyond the usual the things that we all think about, how they clean our air and through carbon sequestration and the filtration of particulate matter out of the air. The shading effect can reduce the air conditioning needs up to 30%. Their canopies, trunks, roots, and associated soil and other natural elements of the landscape filter polluted particulate matter out of the flow toward the storm sewers. The roots of the plant itself cleans up the water that lands on them and that goes down into the soil. And they help reduce erosion, they reduce noise pollution. They just provide so many benefits. And there have been numerous studies that show that they actually encourage people to be nicer. They are more productive when they can see in their workplaces, if they can see greenery. People in hospitalized patients. This came out of a study in England when it was noticed that patients on one side of one hospital wing, where patients could see trees, were being discharged a day earlier than the ones on the other side of the wing, which didn't look at any trees, but at a blank wall. Trees are really a vital part of a healthy interrelationship between people and the outdoors. And if we allow more of the landscape of the open yard to be inside, where it doesn't, come on. Our climate, how often does it rain? Unfortunately, it doesn't rain often enough. And it's been cold lately, but it's unusually cold. That's not typical of Santa Barbara. And so I would not support allowing any use of common indoor area to meet the intent of the purpose of open yards. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Wardlaw?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Lodge. I very much agree with the sentiment that you have expressed, and I appreciate all the words that you have shared. On the first question, yes, I agree with the intent and the direction that we're going. Again, I want to reiterate, I really appreciate staff taking the time to implement changes that are going to allow for more flexibility and to ensure that applicants don't have to go back through an onerous process for simple modifications. So thank you, Metzger, and I appreciate your work. On question number 2, I very much agree with Commissioner Lodge. I do not believe that the intent is aligned. I think that if we are to allow developers to swap outdoor space for indoor space, that will increase the cost of the units likely because they will market them as a gym or something like that. And I think it really goes against our broader goal of ensuring that any development we do is, number one, compatible to the surrounding community, but ideally beneficial to the surrounding community. And to Commissioner Lodge's points, I think that ensuring that the developers invest in the outdoor space is not only important for the residents, but also for the broader community in which we're developing. Thank you, and that's the remainder of my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. Commissioner Higgins?
I like where this is headed with respect to question number 1. I'd like to actually see more flexibility if possible. So my questions earlier were sort of pointed towards giving applicants more options to combine where needed all of the standards into one or several different areas, landscaping, open yard, and setbacks. So I just, the points made about indoor open yard area, about it being an amenity. I think philosophically, we have to just pick what we're trying to do first and go from there. If we're trying to incentivize housing and keep it affordable, relatively affordable, then less amenities is where we should go. And so less amenities indoor and less amenities outdoor. So I don't think the sky is going to be blocked out or fall if we have a little bit less open yard area in some of these projects, but we will see more affordability in the housing projects as they come forward, because there'll be more units and they'll be marketed for less. And you can take that same sentiment and apply it towards parking as well, but we'll get to that in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Commissioner Bauke?
Yes, my video is not, it's being blocked for some reason by the host, so can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, I'll go and she can try to figure out how, what switch she has to do on that. My view is as follows. The 15% is, is reasonable, and the 15% is as being proposed with different ways to address it, I think is reasonable and allows flexibility. The issue that people have brought up as to the indoor recreation, I agree that that's not quite within the intent of what common landscape open space should be. So I would support that position. There's a couple items which have been mentioned that I would put out there. As to the Juliet balconies, that's a great idea, but we need to be very clear as to the depth of that and state as an exception. What happens when you put minimums in that or less than actually, and I would suggest on the ground floor, 8 feet, not 6, and upper floors for balconies to be 6 if they're going to be usable. What you'll find is many builders will build stuff that is not usable. And those are sort of now the common norm depths that are required, which would be 6 feet for upstairs porches and balconies and 8 feet on the ground floor. But that's a case of specificity, which we haven't got in our code currently, and I would recommend and such. But I agree with the intent here to allow much more flexibility in how you approach this.
And on the indoor question number 2.
Yeah, I don't support it as being consistent with the intent, very much like Commissioner Lodge and Wiscombe had mentioned.
Thank you, Commissioner Bauke. And my comments on these questions for number one, yes, absolutely. I like where this direction is going. We've had projects in the past that have struggled with open yard because of the lack of flexibility. And I think this definitely meets that intent. And I appreciate staff listening to stakeholders in designing this. Question number two, I'm absolutely not. I think Commissioner Higgins kind of hit it on the head. If our goal is to maximize housing, incentivizing indoor amenities is not the way to get there. So I'm a no on question two. If Mr. Busk, if we could go to the next set of questions on landscaping, please. Commissioner Higgins, did you have a comment on?
Yeah, I just, I don't understand the philosophy here of if we're gonna not allow a developer to use interior space for open yard, that means that there'll be more open yard outside and less units. So
not necessarily.
How, okay, explain that to me then.
In my perspective, I'll just speak for myself, but in my perspective, you're talking about taking a part of the building envelope and dedicating it to non-residential uses, which takes away from living space. Whereas open yard, you can meet it and not impact the building envelope itself and how it's used.
But you're gonna have to meet it outdoors, aren't you?
Correct.
Okay.
You could put it on the roof. You could have roof decks. You could have balconies. You could have a variety of a mix to meet that 15%. And if other commissioners would like to comment.
Yeah, I just see those as amenities. So.
Commissioner Wortham?
Thank you, Chair, and Commissioner Higgins, on the point of would that be taking away from housing? No, because it's a cap, right? So it would be a 600 square feet as a percent, as one component that is taking away from 15%, right? So if it's a 5,000 square foot building versus a 2,000 square foot building, that percentage is a little bit different, right? So to me, in no way are we taking away from housing. It would be swapping the ability to say you don't have to do as much outdoors, and you can now put that indoors, aka taking away a little bit of housing availability indoors. So to me, that we don't get a benefit in that way. And I do totally agree with your comments. It will be marketed as an amenity and then therefore increasing the cost. And maybe we want to ask Ms. Metzger to clarify anything.
Commissioner Lodge.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say that I agree with the comments that have been saying. It doesn't make any sense. If you allow 600 square feet of the building inside to be counted against outside space, but it is recreational, gym equipment or whatever, it's taking away from housing. Actually, allowing that is taking away from the ability to build housing in that space. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Bonderson.
You'll have to forgive me. I didn't understand the concept of the indoor recreational use being applied towards the outdoor open yard the same way that other commissioners have. My understanding isn't that it takes away from housing, because whether or not it's covered, whether or not it's enclosed, it's still going towards the required full square foot requirement of outdoor open yard. Is that not the way that it was presented by Ms. Metzger?
Ms. Metzger?
Yes, so just to further explain, you are going to have 15% of your lot be open yard. Whatever that is, let's just make it 10,000 square feet. It's a big lot. 600 square feet of that could be indoor space. that doesn't mean that space is only 600 square feet. It could be 1,000 square feet. It just means only 600 square feet of that applies to your total 15% required open yard. I hope that helps.
So just to be clear from that explanation, if a developer wants to put more than the 600 max indoor, then that's on them.
Right. We are not requiring that.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Wiscombe?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think the best way for this for Commissioner Bonderson or Vice Chair Bonderson is that the maximum credit that you would get for indoor open yard, for indoor space that's open yard would be 600 square feet. That no matter, you could make it 10,000 square feet, but you're only going to get 600 square feet the way staff has proposed it.
Thank you, Thank you, Commissioner Whitcomb. I appreciate that. And that's how I got it clarified just now, but you said it a different way and it was very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, any other comments on this item before we move on to landscaping? All right, we'll move on to landscaping then. Are there any commissioners that want to provide answers to the questions? Commissioner Lodge.
Oh. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I think it's a good idea to codify the landscaping guidelines. I wasn't aware we really didn't have any except for parking lots. Yes, a tree should be required in the front yard. And by that, I mean a canopy tree, not palm trees. Palms are not trees. They do not provide all those benefits that I just listed off. And they don't provide, they simply are sticks with some fringe on top. And one tree per 800 square feet of OB is fine. Should the number and type of trees be left up to the architect? No, I don't think so. I'm all for the more trees, the better. And I think it perhaps needs to be spelled out as it has been proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Wiscombe? We'll give it a second.
I don't think she heard you.
I'm sorry. I didn't have my ear. It switched me. It switched my method. Did you call on me?
I did, Commissioner Wiscombe. Yeah.
Okay. I think Ms. Metzger's slide about improving that the landscaping guidelines be codified gives you process improvement, clarity, and objectivity, which is exactly what was in Ms. Metzger's slide. So I totally agree with it. And I'm just going to cite some general plan policies since they're there: LU, LG 12.3, and H 16.8 that I think support just some of them that support codifying the landscape guidelines. Okay, and then we go to one tree per front yard should be required. I don't agree with Commissioner Lodge on this, and there's reasons why. I spent a long time on the as the liaison for the Parks and Recreation Commission to the Street Tree Advisory Committee. I've seen lots of situations where I think that a front yard tree would conflict with a street tree that's already in place. An example of that you know, if you look at the jacarandas on Mission, or you look at Magnolia on Bath Street, there's just too many places where on some of these smaller lots where the front yard is really totally consumed by the branches and the shading of the area by a street tree, that a large canopy street tree that's in place. And I think what we want to do in the city is encourage street trees. We've got an urban forest master plan that has areas where we really, really do need street trees that benefit everybody. And I don't think that requiring a tree, I think there's just too many conflicts to require a tree in the front yard. On number B, 1 tree per 800 square feet of open yard anywhere on the site, I totally agree with that. I think this will enhance at grade open yard spaces. So I would agree with that. And I do agree with Commissioner Lodge on canopy trees. I think we could perhaps emphasize canopy trees, but there's probably some areas of the city where it might be more appropriate to plant the sticks with the fringe on top, as Commissioner Lodge said. Just for continuity of areas, but I think canopy trees should be encouraged. And then the number and type of trees should be left up to the designer. I think the number's already been established perhaps by B as a minimum. And I think the type of tree, again, with emphasis on canopy trees, if possible, should be left up to the architect, designer, or homeowner who prepares the plans.
Commissioner Wiscombe, if I may.
Yeah.
And maybe this is for Ms. Metzger. I think what they are asking is for us to choose from A, B, or C. Ms. Metzger, is that correct, or are we answering each of those? Because it has or at the end of each of those, and that's why I'm a little confused.
Yes, Chair Escobedo, I'm sorry. When I split this question up from your staff report, it was just one sentence. I think A is its own. So if a tree is required, should it be required in the front yard? And then B is, do you think 800 square feet per tree is right? And then C is kind of its own question. Should the number and type, and by type, I only mean for your staff report, canopy or non-canopy tree, not the species.
Okay, my apologies, Commissioner Wiscombe, I was confused.
Okay, no. So I think I've answered all of those. So I guess I really appreciate the addition of the landscape requirements. I think that not necessarily today or in the last week have we received any public comment on this, but we certainly have in the past at Planning Commission meetings and Parks and Recreation Commission meetings where, you know, I think the benefits of trees have really come into play. So I really appreciate what staff has done here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Vice Chair Bonderson.
I am so sorry. I clicked all the buttons in the wrong order. My apologies. So sorry about that. So to begin, number one, I absolutely agree and support that landscape guidelines be codified. It's a great idea. I'm surprised we don't have it yet, but I'm glad that it's been noticed and we're moving forward with this plan. In order to answer number two, I just want to go back to the staff report and the comment that Ms. Metzger made about the section on page 17. Let's see. With regard to the language, she mentioned that it had been cut and pasted from another section and that it has not yet been modified in any way, that it's up to us to request that or discuss that here. So I want to make sure that I plant that comment right here and say, I strongly believe that it's important for us to update this section and provide new language to clarify how the planting and replacing of trees can and should be done. The language is both confusing, but also it doesn't seem to be applicable to all sites. I might be mistaken, but it sounds to me that the 10-to-1 replacement is for habitat restoration. For rural areas, if I remember correctly, it doesn't seem applicable to what we're talking about here. Now, I might be wrong, but it just seemed like the language would not apply to a general site development situation. So for me, I think that it's really important to spend more time with the landscape architects, the practitioners in the community that know this area the best. And certainly to answer number 2, I don't think it should be in our purview per se how to direct the planting of trees. I think it should be per a certified arborist and potentially the landscape architect and expert to look at the site, to look at the street beyond the setbacks of the site, to look at the context of the neighborhood and decide what kind of tree implementation belongs in that neighborhood on that site. And then moving forward with that, I also want to mention that I guess I can go to number 3. That's where this comment can come in. That overlap between the open yard and the landscape aspect. I'm really excited to see the direction that the open yard is going in, because it does provide more flexibility and objectivity. Certainly is going to give us more creativity as well, going into the setbacks, sharing landscape obligations with the open yard is excellent. But I think it's really important to be more clear and to make the language as deliberate as possible in order to clarify the dimensions of things. I might be alone on this, but I still am an advocate for giving more flexibility and being looser on the minimum dimensions to be able to use the site to get the open space needed, especially when it comes to the private open space. Personally, I would prefer, as I believe we probably all would, to live in a place that I have private open space. And that being said, if I were given the choice to design without it or to design with a more flexible minimum, I would much rather provide a outdoor space that's much smaller than the required current 60 square feet than to not require outdoor or not to design with outdoor space at all. That's the limitation that's being put on us with this code. You either give 60 at the 6 times 10 feet, or you don't give it. And we're not required to provide the outdoor space. I think that we should have a happy medium where we say, we can't make the 60, we can't make the dimensions 6 by 10, but we really want to provide some aspect of outdoor space, that Juliet balcony or some other shape or slightly smaller rectangle or whatever, but to not take it off the table altogether. Also with the multi-level open yard, I want to say that the landscape, I would like to suggest that the landscape also be allowed to be on multiple levels. We allow it in the open yard, and I think that it needs to be extended to the landscape so that we can get beautiful landscaped open spaces on multiple levels. Why not? It might not be growing in the dirt in the ground, but at least we have it as a required place to put planting and to have those beautiful sort of aesthetics on higher levels. It does not serve the permeable space, of course, and it won't serve stormwater, but those are all being applied to each project anyway. Even if it's not, the language is not here, it's already expected, and we're being held accountable to design with stormwater BMPs to meet permitting requirements anyway. So you may not be able to make it on multiple levels, but if you can, it should be an offer. It should be an opportunity. So again, releasing that limitation and giving us more flexibility is always encouraged, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's always encouraged. And that takes me to my final thought, and that is the idea that before any landscaped guidelines be codified, it's more work is obviously needed, and it sounds very clear that staff and Ms. Metzger recognize that. I appreciate that. The way it's written, it seems that the proposed guidelines advance previously misunderstood replacement ratios, and it's not really clear how the landscape implementation and long-term maintenance might be recommended as part of the ordinance. I think that should be included. And I think that research into successful guidelines from other jurisdictions should be part of that exercise, as well as organizing workshops again to spend more time with landscape architects and other experts in our community, arborists and other related professionals to help create the consensus, or at least to codify the requirements that make sense to all the professionals in the field. And I see Ms. Metzger raised her hand, so I may have gone out of bounds. What did I say wrong?
Mr. Busk, if you could go to slide 62, I just wanted to touch on something that we didn't really talk about, but I thought might come up. So we actually have, we actually have an enforcement section already for landscape plans. So the landscape plans are approved by the design review bodies, but we do have this enforcement section. So this would be where we would have the situation of going out if maintenance wasn't being upkept, and providing code enforcement actions to keep that in check.
Thank you, Ms. Metzger. You grabbed onto my my long-term maintenance quote and ran with it. I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's really important, especially because a lot of our codes are spread out into different sections. Is there, this isn't a question, but maybe a statement. I've always been an advocate for helping place connectors in the code. So perhaps in the landscape section, there could be a reference to this and send the reader to this 2211-050 and let them know that, you know, as you're reading through the ordinance, there is an enforcement for long-term maintenance. That's fantastic. I'm glad you shared that with us. And that concludes my feedback. Ms. Chair Escobedo, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Balke.
Could we have the prior slide back up so I can reference it? If that's possible.
Slide 55, Mr. Busk.
As to question one, the answer is yes. And to piggyback on Vice Chair Bonderson's comments, a lot of cross-referencing would be very helpful. And as I discussed prior, reference to the street tree public realm standards would be very helpful, and references back to any biofiltration requirements the city has, and those ordinances accordingly would be very helpful. As to the tree issues, my questions are primarily about the city's policy on climate action. If the city wants to take an aggressive stand on climate action, we need to be taking as much action toward planting as many trees as physically possible. And that's really the key thing. So I would answer the answer to 2.A is yes. And to 2.B, it also is yes, but having a waiver process that is similar to the languages in the staff report, in which allows the city arborist to make a determination that it's infeasible due to growing conditions, slope, proximity to other trees, and space limitations. But only in those cases that it makes those findings should you be waiving a requirement of trees, because if we really are serious about our climate action plan goals for carbon reduction, that would be very important. As to trees, question number 2C, the number and type, other than sort of a basic minimum requirement, should be subject to the design review process and up to the architectural designer or the property owner to propose trees. But what I would suggest is the city start thinking more globally as to what an appropriate tree palette, landscape palette is for particular areas within the city. And it may, a citywide approach probably is not recommended because we have a lot of variations, but some kind of neighborhood by neighborhood concept as to what the landscaping should be. And that would also correspond with the master plan for street trees. So that is my comments, other than on 3, back to the cross-referencing on biofiltration and also the street tree requirements and the public realm standards for landscaping should all be tied into this ordinance. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Belke. And I'm going to ask Commissioner Wartha and Commissioner Lodge if I can allow Commissioner Higgins to jump the line. He has to leave the meeting early, and hoping to get his comments on this, and if we have time, parking as well. Commissioner Higgins, if you're ready.
Sure, thank you. All right, so landscaping, number 1, yes. Number 2, I think I really appreciate Commissioner Wiscombe's comments. You know, there may be conflicts, and the more we prescribe about tree planting or whatever, the less, I guess, the more constraints they're going to be on the process. So I'd prefer to leave that up to the architect about where landscaping goes. And so this is not a tree planting ordinance we're talking about. We're talking about a housing ordinance. So just trying to focus on what's important for our city and prioritize. And I don't have any other comments on landscaping, but if you don't mind, I would like to give you some comments on parking.
Yeah, absolutely. Before you start, Mr. Bus, can you bring up the parking questions, please? Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Higgins.
Yes, to question 1. Let's keep it simple. We had an effort a while back with respect to commercial parking in our new zoning ordinance to just simplify how much parking is required for restaurants in general without measuring seats or butts or whatever it is. It's just a straight line square footage, and it's just simpler. So I think that takes the burden off staff too, to have to interpret something different for different areas, and certainly easier for applicants and planning commissioners to understand, or maybe city council members on appeals. No, I don't think we need higher parking in different parts of town. I guess I want to just remind everybody listening that it's okay for us to incentivize certain kinds of housing development, and because we do have a really wide variety out there in the marketplace already. Our existing housing stock is fairly diverse. We do have a lot of apartments already, condos and single family homes, and we certainly have a lot of places already developed that are flush with parking areas. So we're trying to narrow and prioritize what we're doing with new product, and that it may not come with a lot of parking, or frankly any parking, I think is fine. If we're trying to incentivize housing units, then let's do that and give a certain kind of renter or a certain kind of buyer the opportunity to get into a house or unit or condo that doesn't have all of the amenities that we may all be used to, inclusive of parking. So less or no parking brings the rate of the unit down or the cost of the condo down. So we should experiment with that. And if something terrible happens after a couple of years, we'll be back here talking about housing another time. Well, you will, I won't. But there'll be time, that there can be amendments to that. So, excuse me. So similarly, I guess I don't think we need guest parking. So I would be in favor of eliminating guest parking as well. And I think the point here is we're trying to put standards together that don't require discretionary review. But my question on that here is if we get these standards ready for by right housing, and there's a developer or applicant that wants to do something different, the process that we talked about at our last hearing with I can't remember the name we used for the precise plan review. So in other words, if the standards are set and the applicant wants to do something different, they have a choice of applying for a discretionary permit with all of the potential for waivers of some of these standards. Is that correct?
Commissioner Higgins, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. So those are my responses. I appreciate that. And one different comment here, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I do have an announcement for a show item that I was going to make at the end of the hearing today, but I'll let either Allison or somebody else from city staff make that announcement.
Do you, Commissioner Higgins, do you have answers to questions 6 and 7 on the screen?
I'm sorry. Yes, I do agree that we should eliminate covered parking. Yes, we can eliminate covered parking.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Higgins.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow and Commissioner Lodge. We will go back to landscaping, and Commissioner Wardlow, you're up.
Thank you, Chair. On question 1, yes, I very much agree with the comments of the other commissioners. I do agree that it should be codified, especially as our community faces a lot of changes from the state. I want to make sure that we still have our standards in place as we have less authority over discretionary aspects of this. On number 2, I do agree with Commissioner Higgins. I do not want to require more burdensomeness on any applicant going through a process. I do agree with Commissioner Lodge and the importance of trees, but I'm hopeful from the comments by Commissioner Wiscombe as well that through working with the Parks and Recreation Department and other aspects that we can achieve this goal as well. I don't think that the appropriate place is to put that burden on the homeowner or applicant. On number 3, I feel that the remarks made by Commissioner Higgins covers my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wardlow. Commissioner Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say on this tree in the front setback issue, I agree. I like Commissioner Bauke's suggestion that there be a process where there could be a waiver. I'd also like to point out, and this is from the city's urban forest master plan, the urban forest is estimated to contain over 320,000 trees. It's a huge number of trees. And only 10% of those are in public property. The rest is on private property. And so that shows you how important it is to have these requirements that there be the trees to maintain our urban forest and all that it does for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Wardlow?
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. I really did like Commissioner Bauke's point on the waiver and the ability to, I do want to create policy that's going to ensure that we continue to create the urban forest that we have and we all enjoy today. I think I could be amendable to moving forward with something like that if we did have a clear waiver process that was easy for individuals to file. Yeah, I thank you for the further insights, Commissioner Lodge. That's the end of my questions.
Ms. Metzger?
Yes, just to clarify, we didn't speak about this because it didn't quite come up, but there is a process already to waive trees. So that's in place. We'll just make sure to reference it as you spoke on other comments about.
Thank you, Ms. Metzger. I will give my comments. So I'll work my way down. Yes, we should have the landscaping guidelines codified. I do agree that we should require a tree in the front yard and 1 tree per 800 square feet of open yard. And with that added process of getting a waiver if it's infeasible, I think that's reasonable. Additional feedback, I know staff is going to do this anyways, but there was a landscape architect, Ms. Perrone, who suggested that she had some concerns about the landscaping and how it would actually play out in reality. So continuing to get landscape architects feedback as we move through this process and move on to the next steps is really key. And I encourage staff to do exactly that. Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would be, whereas I was opposed to requiring a tree in the front yard, I'd certainly be amenable to putting that in with a waiver process, because I think there's definitely areas of the city where that would just not be appropriate, where we already have large street trees, canopy trees that really would not be conducive to planting another tree. So I'll change my mind on that to what Commissioner Bauke had said. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. One added comment that I'll add to mine is I do have some interest in multi-level landscaping, whether that's green roofs or other sorts of landscaping. I don't know if it meets this landscaping requirement or incorporated somewhere else, but I did want to voice that. Any other additional comments from the commission? Commissioner Bauke, I see your hand up. Is that from your last?
That was for my last. Sorry, I left it on.
No worries. With that, Ms. DeBus, can we move on to the parking question? And who wants to kick it off?
I'll go first since I've got my mic still on.
All right.
That's okay with you. I'll give you sort of my philosophy first and then talk about the particular ones. One of the concerns I've had looking at this as the city's been addressing parking, both with the AUD projects and others, is the unintended consequence that I believe has happened because of the AUD waiver of parking requirements without a corresponding requirement of additional affordable housing. What my analysis shows is what we've had is that waiver requirement has created a higher land value because you didn't get the affordability at the same time. So that's my biggest concern with any of these incentives. We need to trade the incentives for affordable housing that is regulated with deed restrictions, not with the hope and prayer that we just get more housing in a marketplace in which there is going to be demand that we will never meet. So to expect just to build ourselves into affordability is a false flag in this case. So based on that, here's my responses to the question. I would not change anything outside the CDB at this time, unless there is a requirement for additional affordable housing that corresponds with it. You have, and I would caveat that comment with, if there are areas in the city and the city can figure out which neighborhoods aren't already impacted and have parking problems, then maybe those areas could be considered. But at the moment, I see lots and lots of areas in the city that we have significant parking problems, and we're going to make the situation even worse and not get the affordable housing that you're trying to obtain. So that's the same thing. And that same thought process goes with the guest parking. I think you need to require it. And if it wants to be waived by the developer, it needs to come with corresponding affordability. Especially like in the downtown, for example, you have, if you remove structured parking, you're talking $70,000 to $80,000 per space that you're removing from the cost side of the development equation. And all that does, unless you require the affordability on the other end of the equation, you've just ran up the land value price. And we're just going to be chasing our tail here as to affordability in this community. So that's my response to number 3. And for larger projects, I think there should be some ability to have a conversation as to ways to eliminate parking, but it has to be in conjunction with additional affordability. And let's go to the next slide. And as to covered parking, I think you should leave it to the market to address that. You're going to find that, having covered parking is something in which at certain price points, the buyers are going to want that, but I don't think you have to require it, and leave that up to the developers would be the appropriate way to do that. And as to 7, I think you just treat it the same between covered parking requirements for condos and apartments and cooperatives, leaving the market to determine which format they want, because basically you don't want to add costs if you don't have to, especially if we're trying to get affordability as the end goal here. So thank you, and that's my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Bauke. Commissioner Lodge? You're muted, Commissioner Lodge.
I want to express my agreement with everything that Commissioner Bauke had to say on this issue. The big mistake that the city made with the AUD program in the first place, because some of us, when the developer community said, if you give us these incentives, we will build market rate housing that is middle income affordable, we believe that would be the case. Well, it is not, and it hasn't been. We should have said, okay, you can have this kind of density and increased density if it's affordable. And this is the direction that Commissioner Bauke's comments are going. The incentives that have been given have been huge, and we need to demand affordability first before we get any more. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Who wants to go next? Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also agree with Commissioner Bauke's comments. I think we are putting incentives ahead of affordability here, and we've really given a lot. And I'm coming from a slightly different standpoint, and this is something we hear over and over again, and we did get some public comment on it. And I have talked to some people I know that are highly impacted by the developments that have gone in and the impacts to street parking. And it's really taking a toll on our neighborhoods, not all of them, but some of them. And I feel that we need to put the brakes on this a little bit. I like what we've done in the CBD, and I think I think that for guest parking in the CBD, I'm okay with that. The downtown parking will, you can park in the lots. They're never, I don't think they're ever close to 100% full. And if you're going to visit someone in the CBD, I think that's appropriate to do. But I think we do need to put the brakes on this and perhaps tie any sort of reduction in parking to affordability. I can see Ms. Metzger's come on here. Go ahead, Ms. Metzger.
Thank you, Chair Escobedo and Commissioner Wiscombe. I just want some clarity on what Commissioner Balke said. So I have that he had no changes outside the central business district. But if we go to slide 34, please, Ms. DeBus, what we're asking you is we already have this standard for rentals now on the left-hand side of the screen. Should condominiums and the upper state overlay be the same? Or is that comment meaning condos should stay at a higher parking rate? I just would like clarity, sorry.
My comment is that you, at this point in time, and if I had my way, I'd roll back a lot of this stuff, but that's not the question at hand. I would say that we keep the multifamily residential and mixed use outside the CBD at the ratios that you currently show in your current ordinance, unless we go through a process of determining additional affordability if you start lowering these ratios down. That was what my general thesis is.
So you're okay with condos having a different parking requirement than rentals?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Back to you, Commissioner Wiscombe.
Yeah, that's what I heard Commissioner Balke to say, and I think that his comments about leaving it to the market is very important. Some developers will build parking and at more than the minimum, and some will not. Some will just take the minimum. So I think it's important, and we don't know what the developer's market is, what target the developer's going after, but I think that this gives some sort of stability to where we are. And I agree that I really do agree that we have these neighborhoods that are so impacted by parking that we really need to take a good look at this, I think, before giving more incentives for this. And I guess in terms of covered parking, again, I think Commissioner Balke hit the nail on the head. It's market driven. In my conversations with Ms. Metzger, we talked about the fact that uncovered parking has to be screened. I'm fine with that. I think this is, again, a market driven thing, and developers should be able to develop covered or uncovered, whatever their cost constraints are, and also what market they're targeting. At this point, I'm just not sure that we're going to get a lot more affordable units by giving more incentives at this point. And it should be, as Commissioner Balke said, the other way around. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Commissioner Wardlow?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. On the first question, I am supportive of having all of the multi-unit housing in condominiums and rental housings have the same requirements. On the second piece, I do think that the USSS overlay zone should be in line with all other aspects of the city. And maybe, you know, I'm misunderstanding some of Commissioner Bauke's concerns about question 1. But at this point, that's how I feel on those 2 points. So sorry, going to guest parking. I do feel that eliminating the guest parking for the multi-unit development is fine in the CBD. Again, Commissioner Bauke and Commissioner you guys have made some good points, and I've actually reconsidered how I feel about this a little bit. But at this point, I do think that eliminating the guest parking is okay with me. For larger projects, I think that going through the discretionary review is still the best option. I really think that we need to be moving away from parking as a broad in the big picture of things. I understand that you guys are focused on the incentives from a affordability perspective, but I'm still thinking of it from the perspective of the graph that Metzger put up of this unit is the equivalent to an actual unit for somebody to live in. And how do we move away from that? So to me, I think we do get rid of the guest parking, and I can go on to the next ones. Covered parking, again, I understand what you all are saying about let the market decide, but if this is a requirement that currently exists, I think we do away with that requirement. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Commissioner Ward. The Vice Chair Bonderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to start by saying that I strongly agree and am very interested in the perspective that Commissioner Bauke has presented to us today. And the comments that I'm about to make may or may not go hand in hand with what he has said, but it doesn't detract with my agreement with him. I'm going to answer these questions from a slightly different angle. And I'm going to make some of them, not all of them, but some of them also personal. To start with, question number 1, I don't agree that all types should be the same. And that has to do with the fact that not all areas of town and the on-street parking is the same. This goes back to my comment earlier that I believe we need a parking impact study in the areas outside of the CBD that have not yet been looked at before we apply this type of umbrella statement, this all-encompassing ordinance to all of the city. That being said, I also feel that different types of housing may require different types of parking. If someone is choosing to live in a condominium and has a family with several children and potentially 2 working adults that require a vehicle, they should have the option to purchase or to invest in a second parking spot. I would like to imagine that would be something that would be available. Now in the CBD, if you need a second parking spot, you can go a few blocks away and use the public parking. And to me, that's an excellent option. That option may not be available in other areas of town. And this is where it gets personal for me because I've lived in a number of different types of housing, from single family homes to affordable housing myself. Most people may not know that, where a single parking spot was offered, but the second spot was never available. And it would take sometimes over an hour to find a spot nearby being as close as possible, and then walking home. And that might not be an option for a woman with a stroller and a child and a second child. It might not be an option for someone who has difficulty walking or an elderly person who needs some support. Now, we have to take some of those things into consideration, but this may not be the time or place to do that. So my mind is always on those exceptions. And that's why I brought up the ADA options earlier. And I heard staff loud and clear that that's a state mandate. It's not something local. But as we start removing parking spots and removing guest spots that might even go to the homeowners themselves or the renters themselves, it always becomes an important flag for me to say there are going to be people who either live in that on that property or are visiting that property that may not have the option of walking very far distances and need support. So that being said, I can't agree fully with this. I think that it needs to be vetted, and I think a study would be very, very important before we make the decisions in different areas of town. And so going to the guest parking, I've already sort of answered in there. I think you can probably pull out my answer. So I have no problem eliminating guest parking in the CBD because we have options, and you know, parking is available. Yes, you pay for it, but that's okay. But it wouldn't be applicable if we were on the outside of that zone at this moment, because we don't necessarily know how available street parking is, and some areas are more impacted than others. And for larger projects, and in some locations, yes, I think that we should be allowed to have discretionary review for exceptions and for requests for changes that may be out of the ordinary. I think that that's always an option that should be kept in place. For questions 6 and 7, I don't have a problem with whether or not the parking is covered or not, as long as parking is available and it's appropriate for the area. And the one thing that I would say with number 7 is that I do believe that condos for home ownership should be different than community apartments, rentals, or even affordable housing. Affordable housing should have a completely different requirement and provide incentives. We do want to support housing. We want to allow for more opportunity. And therefore, it's really important to often follow the market. I completely agree with the discussion about the market that Commissioner Balke brought up. And also to look at each individual area, or perhaps the site and the constraints of the site, and having that opportunity to have modifications and discretionary review and opportunities for exceptions is always important. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you for letting me express myself on this one. It's very personal for me.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bonderson. Are there other comments from any of the commissioners before I start mine? Not seeing any. Okay. So Mr. Busk, if you could go back to the previous slide. And I'll start with saying Commissioner Balke's comments are very persuasive, and they resonate with me. I am interested in an idea where maybe for a higher inclusionary that we have incentives like this, like lower parking, or I need to think about that one a little bit more, but I'm also persuaded by the fact that we need to start building towards infrastructure that is less focused on cars and vehicles. And if we're thinking about climate change, that's going to be a big one. That's a big question that we need to start figuring out, which is why I asked that question of staff is, what is our long-term plan for, as Vice Chair Bonderson had mentioned, the parent with a stroller that needs to get around, that can't take a B-cycle bike and needs to go and get groceries and whatnot. So I am also persuaded by the fact that these requirements apply to the housing authority too. So it's difficult, but I'm gonna err on the side of for number 1, I'm gonna say yes. It makes it simpler for staff. It makes it a simpler process to have the parking requirements the same for all types of multi-unit housing. Should a higher parking requirement be maintained in the upper State Street overlay zone? I'm gonna say no. for guest parking can be eliminated in the CBD, absolutely. For larger projects or in some city locations, using a discretionary process, I'm not the biggest fan, but there should be, this is where that higher affordability, the higher inclusionary percentage, I think comes into play with incentives like these, that with higher inclusionary, you can get rid of and eliminate guest parking. It's much more objective. We get something in return. I like that versus a discretionary review. To the next slide, please, Mr. Busk. And then, yes, I agree with eliminating covered parking requirements for both 6 and 7. And I'll just say there is a lot of validity to what Commissioner Balke had mentioned about increase in land prices and incentives, and that there's a trade-off between those. And I think as we move ahead with the multi-unit housing policy throughout this year, I personally would, and I think it sounds like the Planning Commission as a whole would like to see that incorporated into the way that we approach policy in our update to the AUD program. And if we do replace the AUD program, I would be very interested to hear from staff and future staff reports on how we can create some of those trade-offs. So those are my comments. Thank you to Commissioners. Vice Chair Bonderson.
Thank you for allowing me to add one thing, Chair Escobedo. Now that you go last, it's hard to agree when nobody goes after you, but I'm going to take this opportunity to say I actually agree with a lot of things you said, and something you said triggered a reminder for me. I didn't want to lose the opportunity to add this one point. I think that the ADU ordinance has gotten something right. They have implemented the idea that if the development of that ADU on the property is located within half a mile of transit, then that new unit wouldn't require parking. And I think that that should be something that we consider. We would need a parking study, a community, like area by area, to understand where those distances are, where those bus stops or other options are in comparison to those locations. But that would be another way to support reduced parking, because you have the ability to access transit. But you have to keep in mind that not all areas outside of the CBD have a bus stop within easy walking distance. So those are some things, like you mentioned, and I'm a huge advocate for. We need to be thinking about public transportation hand in hand with these decisions on parking. And you can't put one before the other. They go hand in hand. So I just wanted to emphasize that extra thought about the ADU issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bonderson. Any additional comments from commissioners? All right. So with that, if there are no other comments, then we'll close out item 3. Well, before we do, Ms. Metzger, did you get the information you were looking for? You're muted, Ms. Metzger.
Sorry. Thank you for that. Yes, I got all of the comments down and we'll move forward accordingly.
Awesome. Oh, Commissioner Wiscombe.
I believe, Ms. Metzger, did you put up a slide with other comments on it for?
Oh yes, that's the next slide. Sorry, I am not running the slides out. Mr. Buss doesn't have to put that up. The last slide was any additional comments that you may have.
Okay, so I'm going to just take this opportunity. Hopefully Ms. Ostringer is not going to jump on here, since we're talking about amendments to multi-unit housing policies. So, which is where this goes. I had brought this up, Commissioner Lodge and I had discussed this, and I brought this up at the at one of our previous meetings when we were discussing multi-unit housing. I think it's the one where we actually did recommended the precise plan and et cetera. But I would like to again reiterate a recommendation, not from the Planning Commission, but I think Commissioner Lodge and I agree on this, that we consider expanding, the consideration be given to expanding the AUD program to include smaller efficiency units, i.e. micro units in the CBD. We currently have a maximum in the AUD program of 63 dwelling units per acre with an average maximum unit size of 811 square feet. So if we could have a sliding scale that allowed developers to do smaller efficiency units of 250 to 400 square feet, which are very popular in some cities, then we could expand the maximum number of dwelling units per acre and perhaps, get close to doubling it. So I just wanted to bring that up again and make that as a additional comment to what we're talking about here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. I myself am, as I think about what we discussed today about incentives and the trade-off for affordability, I also think about our last multi-unit housing meeting, and in talking about the tiers, we had seen tiers for the FAR program. And I think that tier idea is really interesting. I gotta, Ms. Ostringer?
Yes, Chair Escobedo. The agenda was generally limited to the parking and landscaping and open yard. So I kind of let it go a little bit, but I don't want to expand too much out of what the agenda was set for. So I'll just say that.
To tie it back. And then, so anyways, the tier idea for what we talked about for some of the parking incentives would be interesting. But we'll leave it at that, and we will close out this item 3, and move on to the administrative agenda. Do we have, well, actually, let's start with Mr. Buss, because I believe there's a staff hearing officer update.
Yes, thank you, Chair Escobedo. At the staff hearing officer meeting last Wednesday, there was an interesting item at 418. Sorry, let me make sure I get the address correct. 418 North Salsa Puedes. And that show decision has been suspended by our show liaison, who is Commissioner Higgins. What that means is that the project will be brought up to the Planning Commission for a decision. Just so that commissioners understand this process, it's very similar to an appeal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the show liaison had a concern with the decision. It may just mean that this project is one that warrants review by a larger body rather than the one-person staff hearing officer. So that item has been suspended, and we will be scheduling it for an upcoming Planning Commission meeting as soon as we can coordinate with the applicant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buss. Other committee and liaison reports. All right. Commissioner Bauke?
Yeah, I just wanted to inform the audience that there is a design standard work group meeting next Friday at 10 o'clock. And we're going to really be getting into the first work product that the consultant has generated.
All right. Thank you for that update. Any other committee or liaison reports? Not seeing any. So, Commissioner Wiscombe.
I couldn't get to my raised hand quickly enough before you closed out the meeting. I just wanted to mention, and it's not officially agendized yet, I don't think, because we were still waiting to see if committee members were able to attend, but the preliminary plan is to have a De La Guerra Plaza committee, revitalization committee meeting next Friday. And actually Commissioner Bauke's comment about their meeting next Friday triggered me to think about this. Next Friday at in the morning, I think ending by about 10 o'clock. So that would be on February 11th. So I'll keep you posted on that. We don't have a commission meeting next week. Is that correct, Mr. Busk?
That is correct.
Okay, so you just have to watch and see if it pops up as an agendized item. It would be a discussion following the Historic Landmarks Commission review of the concept plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. And it looks like those are all of our committee and liaison reports. So we will call this meeting. This meeting is over at 4:45. Thank you, everyone. No meeting next week, but we'll have a meeting on the 17th.